The Force is old and full of shadows.
The turbolift hummed. That was the only sound Anakin Skywalker allowed himself to hear. Not the muffled thunder of Coruscant's skylane 17 stories below, not the faint tremor of the temple's ventilation moving through the walls, not the soft mechanical breath of the lift itself as it climbed toward the highest room in the most sacred building in the Republic. Just the hum. A single, clean note. He used it the way a drowning man uses a rope. His hands were still. He noticed that first, the stillness, the way you notice the absence of pain after years of carrying it. His hands had not been still before a council summons in 10 years. Before Geonosis, they had tapped against his thigh in a rapid, unconscious rhythm that Obi-Wan had pointed out exactly once and never mentioned again. Before Christophsis, they had been balled into fists at his sides, white-knuckled, every knuckle a small argument with himself about what he deserved, and what he had earned, and why the two never seemed to match. Today, they rested, open at his sides, palms loose, fingers easy. The way his hands looked when he slept. He ran the numbers. He had been running them for 3 days, the way a man with a fever checks his own temperature, obsessively, hopefully, mistrustfully, kato ne moidia, the bridge. The free fall. Obi-Wan's voice in his ear saying hold on as if Anakin needed to be told. The separatist fleet over Coruscant, 9 capital ships and the rescue that followed. And Dooku dead on the floor of the invisible hand with the whole ugly architecture of the war ending between one breath and the next. He had earned this. 3 days of calculation, and the answer never changed. He had earned this. The question, the real one, the one the numbers couldn't answer, was whether they knew it. The lift slowed, stopped, the doors opened onto the peak of the world. The council chamber received light from every direction. It had been built that way deliberately, 12 windows for 12 seats, the sky on all sides, so that nothing in this room could hide in shadow, and no one who entered it could pretend the weight of what happened here was anything less than absolute. Anakin had stood at the center of this circle more times than he could count. He knew the exact quality of the light at each hour, knew which seat each master occupied by muscle memory before he looked, knew the sound the chamber made in silence, the particular held breath quality of 12 Force presences in one room, like standing in the eye of something that was trying very hard not to move. He knew all of it. He walked into it anyway. Mace Windu stood at the center window with his back to the room. That was unusual. Mace was a man of ceremony without being a man who liked ceremony. He had simply understood long ago that ceremony gave people something to hold on to when the truth was too heavy to carry unadorned. He stood at his window the way a man stands at the edge of a decision he has already made, looking out over the city, and the light came through onto the dark planes of his face and made him look like something carved from a harder material than flesh. Obi-Wan stood at his own station, 3rd seat from the east window. His expression gave nothing away. It never did. But his eyes, those precisely controlled, thoughtful eyes that Anakin had been reading since he was 9 years old, and could already tell the difference between Obi-Wan as disappointed and Obi-Wan as being careful. His eyes were warm. Simply, privately warm. The warmth of a man who already knows the ending of a story and has been waiting for the other person to arrive at it. Yoda's eyes were half closed. One hand rested on the curved head of his Geimer stick. He was reading something in the Force, the currents in the room, the emotional weather of it, with the unhurried attention of a being who has had 9 centuries to develop patience and has chosen to use every year of them. Anakin stepped to the center, the doors closed behind him. Master Skywalker. Mace turned from the window. The honorific landed before anything else, and the weight of it was so unexpected that Anakin very nearly missed what came next. The Council has deliberated at length regarding your appointment as our representative to the Chancellor's office. That deliberation is complete. A pause. Not theatrical. Mace Windu did not do theatrical. It was the pause of a man being precise. There is the matter of what that appointment requires of this Council. What it requires of us, honestly and without the comforting evasion of institutional procedure, to acknowledge about the man we are sending. The chamber was very quiet. You went to Kato Neamwedia and came back. You went into that ship and came back. You have gone, again and again, into the places this order needed someone to go, and you came back, and you never once asked us to notice. Something moved in Mace Windu's face. Not softening, exactly. The bones of him were too authoritative for softening, but an adjustment. A recalibration toward honesty. We noticed, Skywalker. We have always noticed. We were simply a fractional pause. Slower than we should have been to say so. He straightened. You are on this council. The words came with the finality of a door closing on everything that came before them. And we grant you the rank of Master. The room held still. Later, Anakin would not be able to say what he had expected to feel. Triumph. Maybe. The hot, clean rush of vindication. Or perhaps the complicated, flat thing that comes when you've wanted something so long the wanting has become its own weight, so that receiving the thing only lets you feel how heavy the waiting was. He had expected something large, something proportionate to the decade of hunger that had preceded it. What he felt was this. Something behind his sternum came loose. It was such a small physical sensation. A loosening. The easing of a tension so habitual he had forgotten it was tension, had mistaken it for architecture, for the load-bearing structure of who he was. And now, it was gone. And he was still standing, and the room was still the room, and 12 masters were still watching him, and he simply stood there for one breath. One long, real, open breath, and felt what it was like to be himself without the weight. He wanted to ask if they meant it. He didn't. Thank you, Master Windu. His voice was steady, slower than usual by half a beat, each word placed with a care that was not about dignity but about making sure none of them cracked before he reached the end of the sentence. Thank you. All of you. Across the chamber, Obi-Wan met his eyes. He gave one nod. A single, small, unadorned nod that contained an entire decade inside it. Every argument they'd ever had at midnight in a tent on some planet that deserved better than a war. Every time Obi-Wan had said the Council will see it eventually, in a tone that meant I already do. Every moment his former master had chosen to wait rather than push, because he understood. With that infuriating, profound patience, that some things had to arrive in their own time. The nod said, here it is. Your time. Finally, Anakin looked away before his face could do anything unbecoming of a master. The sun was setting over Coruscant when he arrived at 500 Republica. The Chancellor's suite occupied a floor whose entire western face was transparent steel, and at this hour it caught the day's last light and held it. Amber and deep violet bleeding into each other across the skyline, the city planet's 10,000 towers beginning to warm from below as their lights answered the darkening sky. Anakin barely saw it. He had stood in this room enough times that its beauty had become furniture. What he noticed today was that it felt smaller than usual. Palpatine read him the moment he crossed the threshold. Anakin had always known the Chancellor was perceptive. It had been one of the things he admired, that quality of complete, focused attention that made a person feel seen. But today he watched the old man's gaze travel across him with a speed and precision that was almost clinical, and he saw. In the fraction of a second before the warm smile arrived, the thing that preceded it. Calculation. Anakin. Palpatine rose from behind his desk. You look lighter. The Council granted the rank. Chancellor. He said it simply, without theater. All of them. Well, the smile opened into something broad, delighted, avuncular. He moved to pour tea. He asked about the proceedings. He said all the correct things in the correct order with the warmth of a man who had spent decades perfecting warmth until it was indistinguishable from the genuine article. Anakin sat and accepted the tea and answered the questions. And underneath the ordinary ease of it he felt the shape of something he had never felt in this room before. He felt like a guest. Of course, Palpatine said, settling into his chair, his voice dropping to its more intimate register, the one reserved for the private moments, the real conversations. Even masters can find the Council limiting. Their rules have always struck me as better suited to a monastery than a war. The old invitation. Anakin recognized it the way you recognize a street you've walked 100 times. He set down his cup, I think I misunderstood them, Chancellor, for a long time. He considered it honestly, the way the vault had taught him to consider things, without the static of old grievance in the way. They're not withholding, they're carrying something very heavy. We all are. A brief pause. Master Windu told me once that the hardest thing the Council does isn't fighting Sith. It's deciding what kind of people we remain while we do it. He looked up. I think I finally understand what he meant. The silence that followed lasted less than 2 seconds. Palpatine smiled. It arrived promptly, perhaps a quarter second too promptly, and it was perfectly constructed and completely correct in every visible particular. His eyes creased. His posture remained open. He said something gracious about wisdom earned through experience. Anakin thanked him for the tea and took his leave. Outside, the city blazed. He walked down the steps of 500 Republica into the amber evening, his hands easy at his sides, the hum of the sky lanes warm and continuous around him. He did not look back. If he had, he would have seen the Chancellor standing at the great transparisteel window of his suite, watching him go, the warm smile entirely absent now, replaced by something older, colder, precise as a calculation, and patient as geology, moving slowly behind pale eyes. Anakin did not look back. He walked into the evening and let the city hold him, and he was lighter than he had been in years. And he did not yet know what the window behind him contained. He would. It came for him at the 3rd hour. Not gradually, not the slow, creeping unease of a bad dream assembling itself from the edges inward. It arrived whole, the way a door slams, Padme on a medical table, her face gray-white against white linen, her hand in his going slack with the particular terrible finality of a hand that has stopped deciding to hold on. The medical droid's voice, flat and procedural, saying something he could never quite hear in full. The dream always ate the words before they arrived. And the sound of monitors flattening to a single tone, and his own voice from somewhere outside his body saying her name, and her not answering, and the light in the room going the color of endings. He woke with a sound he did not recognize as coming from himself. Sat up. The sheets were twisted around his legs. His heart was doing something brutal and arrhythmic against the inside of his ribs, and he pressed the heel of his mechanical hand against his sternum, not to slow it, just to feel the pressure, to confirm that the ribs were there, that he was in a room, that the room was real. Padme slept beside him. He watched her breathe for a long time. In, out the chest rising, falling, the rhythm of a body at work, unconscious, automatic, indifferent to his terror. She was warm. He could feel the warmth from here. She had pushed the sheet down in the night, and one arm was thrown over her head in the sprawling, unself-conscious way she only slept when she was deeply, genuinely at rest. She was fine. The dream said otherwise, with the absolute conviction of a thing that has been said so many times it has started to sound like fact. He had been here before, many nights before this one. He knew the shape of what came next, the lying awake, the cold calculation of how much time she might have, the mounting, nauseating certainty that he was running out of it. The way every normal moment, her laughing at something he said, her hand on his arm in passing, would start to feel like a countdown. He knew this road. He had walked it until the pavement of it was worn into him. Tonight, something interrupted the pattern. He was a Jedi Master. He had been one for 4 days. The thought arrived quietly, without ceremony. The way genuinely useful thoughts tend to arrive, not as revelation but as simple fact that has been waiting patiently for a moment of stillness in which to be noticed. He was a Jedi Master. He had unrestricted access to the holocron vaults. He had been lying awake, night after night, terrified of a problem that a library might answer, and it had not once occurred to him to go to the library. He reached for his robe. The temple at the 3rd hour was a different creature than the temple during the day. Not empty. It was never empty. Not fully. Not with thousands of Jedi and Padawans and initiates in various states of training or mission or meditation moving through it at all hours, but hushed in the way that large. Stone-built things are hushed when the specific people who make them loud are asleep. The training halls stood open and dark. The corridors carried only the occasional soft footstep of a late-moving Padawan, or the distant methodical sound of someone in a meditation chamber working through something that couldn't wait for morning. The archive lobby glowed amber. The bronzium statues of the Lost 20 lined the entrance hall, 20 Jedi Masters who had voluntarily left the Order across its history, their faces rendered in cold metal with an attention to expression that had always struck Anakin as quietly mournful. He passed them without looking. He had never liked this hall much. Tonight, he barely registered it. Jocasta Nu was at her desk. She was always at her desk. It was one of the enduring logistical mysteries of the temple, whether the woman slept, whether she had some arrangement with time itself that permitted her to be simultaneously in the archives, and everywhere the archives needed defending. She looked up at him over the precise geometry of her reading glasses. Her gaze traveled to his rank insignia, to his face, back to his insignia. Her expression did not warm. Jocasta Nu's expression never warmed in the way other people's did, but something in it shifted. The faint professional wariness that had always underscored her interactions with him, the particular guardedness of a scholar managing an impulsive young knight she did not entirely trust with fragile things. It was simply gone. In its place, a collegial precision. Peer-to-peer. The specific respect of someone who takes the architecture of rank seriously and has just revised her assessment accordingly. Master Skywalker. She removed her glasses. The vault is open to you. What are you looking for? He told her. Force visions. The mechanics of them. The academic literature. Jedi healing traditions, particularly anything predating the formal Jedi-Sith split. And he kept his voice level, informational, documented cases of dark side influence on Jedi Force perception. She looked at him for a moment. Not judgmentally. More the way a doctor looks at a patient who has just described a specific constellation of symptoms that means something precise to someone who knows what to listen for. Follow me, she said, and rose from her desk. The vault door read him without drama. He had expected something more, some ceremony of confirmation, some resistance from the mechanism, some acknowledgement that this was the first time. Instead, the Force lock simply recognized the living harmonic of his presence, found it consistent with what it was looking for, and opened. The door was thick enough that it moved with a sound like the first breath of something long sealed. A deep, settled exhalation. And then he was inside. The vault was silent. Genuinely, completely silent, the kind that presses lightly against the ears, the kind that makes a person suddenly aware of their own breathing. The ambient hum of the temple, ever present everywhere else, stopped at the threshold as though it knew better than to follow. The lighting was low and amber, emanating from sources he couldn't immediately identify, giving the room a quality like late evening filtered through thick glass. Along the walls, the holocrons, their casings dark and dormant, ancient geometries in varied materials, some clearly Jedi, faceted and smooth, others with the irregular, almost biological quality of Sith construction. In the far alcoves, the manuscripts. Physical texts, real paper and real binding, some of them under preservation fields that gave them the faint shimmer of things being kept carefully intact. Jocasta Nu showed him where the healing archives began. She showed him the vision literature. She showed him, with the same unhurried precision, where the Sith methodology academic research was indexed. And then she said, "I'll leave you to it," and left. And he was alone in the silence with everything the Order had decided was too dangerous or too complicated for anyone below the rank of Master. He sat down. He opened the first manuscript. He began. The first day was the healing texts. The Jedi manuscripts were dense, pre-standardized galactic basic archaic grammatical structures. A habit of expressing abstract concepts through physical metaphor that required him to slow down and rebuild meaning from the words, rather than reading across them. But he was motivated in a way that made difficulty largely irrelevant, and so he worked through them, line by line, rebuilding the architecture of a tradition that the Order had largely set aside. He found the living bond anchoring technique in the fourth manuscript. He read the description of it twice. Then a third time. It described a Force-sensitive, creating a persistent, light-side envelope around a non-sensitive loved one, not protection from ordinary harm, but something more specific, a real-time connection to that person's actual living Force presence. Their genuine physical state, unmediated, immediate, not a vision, not a fear. The thing itself. He set the manuscript down. He reached through the Force for Padam. The bond formed tentatively, barely. It was the first genuine attempt, and he had no training in this. And it was the middle of the night, but even so it gave him something. Warmth. A steady, uncomplicated warmth. The particular quality of a body doing what it was designed to do. Tiredness, but the ordinary tiredness of a woman who was pregnant and working too hard. Health, under it all, as a baseline. The visions had told him she was dying. The Force told him she was asleep. He sat with that for a long time, and said nothing, because there was no one to say anything to, and the vault held its silence around him like a kept confidence. The second day was the Sith methodology section. He approached the holocrons with care, leaving the Bane artifact and the Nihilist case entirely untouched. The catalog warnings were sufficient to explain why without needing to investigate further. But there were smaller records. Scholar Sith of earlier eras, analytical rather than purely martial, who had written with academic detachment on manipulation methodology. He was not here for their philosophy. He was here for their techniques. He found the entry on resonant contamination 4 hours in. It was written as a tactical document, the tone almost dry, the way military manuals are dry. The way anything is dry when you strip the moral dimension from it and write only about mechanism. The technique, as described, a Sith of sufficient power, operating in sustained close proximity to a Force-sensitive target, could corrupt the target's own Force connection over time, turn it against itself, introduce experience through it, not quite vision, not quite memory, but something that used the target's own capacity for Force perception as the delivery mechanism. The closer the proximity, the more effective. The more emotionally compromised the target, the more fear already present, the more existing grief already doing structural work in the psyche, the less effort required. Anakin took out a stylus. He began writing down a timeline. His own. Every conversation with the Chancellor in the past year. Every night the dreams had been worst. Every morning he had woken sick with certainty about Padam's death. And then, within hours, found himself in Palpatine's office, or in his company at some Senate function. He mapped them against each other. The proximity of the man to the intensity of the visions. The geography of it assembled itself in front of him like a star chart clarifying as you pull back to a wider view, each individual data point becoming a coordinate in a pattern so clear it was almost geometric. He stared at what he had drawn. The third day was the Vision Codex. He read it with the focused, methodical patience of a general reviewing enemy tactics, not looking for confirmation of what he feared, but building the evidentiary case from the ground up, letting it arrive at its own conclusion without forcing it. He catalogued the documented markers of dark side vision corruption, the visual completeness, too cinematic, too narratively whole, lacking the symbolic fragmentation of naturally arising Force visions. The repetition, a locked loop, returning unchanged, not evolving with new probable future data because it was not a prediction, but a program. The directionality, which a sufficiently still observer could trace, a planted vision pressed inward from outside, while an organic vision rose from within. He read the case study from 200 BB. A Sith operative, presenting as a respected Republic official, over 2 years of sustained proximity, had successfully corrupted the Force perception of 3 senior Jedi Masters simultaneously, had made them see what he needed them to see, had made them afraid of things that did not exist, and blind to things that did. Anakin closed the codex. He set it flat on the reading surface in front of him, and placed both hands on it, and looked at the cover, which was plain, which told him nothing new, which was simply the outside of the thing he had just finished reading. He sat in the vault's particular silence. The amber light hummed at its low frequency, somewhere above him, through stone and history and the living weight of the temple. The sun was rising over Coruscant. He knew who Palpatine was. He knew what had been done to him. He knew Padam was safe. He knew he was the only person in the galaxy currently holding all of this at once, and that the holding of it was a temporary condition, that it needed to become a shared weight, immediately, in the hands of someone he trusted completely. Footsteps in the vault entrance, unhurried, deliberate. Jocasta Nu set a cup of tea on the reading surface beside the codex. She did not ask what he had found. She did not ask if he was all right. She simply looked at him over her glasses for a moment, the look of a woman who has spent a lifetime in proximity to the truth and has learned to recognize the specific expression of a person who has just found it. And then she returned to the corridor, and her footsteps receded, and he was alone again, with the silence and the tea, and the thing he now knew. He picked up the tea. He held it in both hands. He needed Obi-Wan. He rehearsed it 14 times on the walk over. Not the words exactly. He had never been good at words exactly, had always been better at the thing itself than the architecture around the thing, but the shape of it. The order. He had decided somewhere between the vault and the residential wing that the only way to do this was chronologically, the way you file a mission report. What happened, when, in sequence, without editorializing. Start with the fact that would be hardest to hear. Lead with it. Get it out of the room so that everything that came after could breathe. I have been married for 3 years. He tried it under his breath as he turned down the corridor toward Obi-Wan's quarters. The words felt strange outside his skull, too plain, too brief for what they carried. 3 years of a secret kept in the specific way that secrets are kept when they are not shameful, but simply impossible to explain within the architecture of the life you are living. 3 years of Padme's hand in the dark, and the apartment with the Coruscant lights coming through the window, and the careful management of every public moment, every Senate function. Every mission debrief where someone made a comment about the senator from Naboo and he had to arrange his face into something that looked like professional indifference. He stopped outside Obi-Wan's door, raised his hand to knock. The door opened before he touched it. Obi-Wan stood in the doorway in his undershirt, a cup of tea already in hand. With the expression of a man who woke early by nature and had woken earlier this morning than usual, for reasons he was not yet willing to articulate. He looked at Anakin. He did the thing with his eyes, the reading, the quiet, rapid calculation that had always been more accurate than any sensor Anakin had ever worked with. And then he stepped back. "Come in," he said. "Sit down. I'll get another cup." He didn't ask what was wrong. He never asked, had never asked, in 15 years, in the way that some people do not ask because they are incurious, or because they are afraid of the answer. Obi-Wan didn't ask because he understood, with the bone-deep patience of a man who had raised someone difficult and loved him for it, that the question would only build another wall. He simply made space and waited, and the waiting had always been both the kindest and the most tormenting thing about him. Kindest because it was real, tormenting because it made lying functionally impossible. Anakin sat. He put his hands flat on his knees, a physical discipline he had borrowed from Obi-Wan years ago, and still used when he needed to keep himself from fidgeting or from reaching for something. Obi-Wan brought the second cup, and settled into the chair opposite, and looked at him with that open, unhurried attention that contained no demand in it at all. "Padme Amidala and I were married 3 years ago," Anakin said, "on Naboo, after the Battle of Geonosis." He heard himself say it and felt the strangeness of it, not shame, nothing so simple as shame, but the specific vertiginous quality of a secret becoming a fact in the presence of another person. A thing that has existed only in the sealed chamber of your own life, suddenly taking up real space in the real room. "I know what you're going to say," he said. "I'm going to say," Obi-Wan replied, with the absolute quietness of someone delivering a sentence they have been holding ready for a long time, "that I know." The silence that followed was not empty. It was dense, pressurized, full of the specific weight of "I know" and everything that came beneath it. Anakin looked at him. Obi-Wan looked back with that steady, composed warmth, and there was nothing in it that resembled judgment. There was something in it that looked, remarkably, like relief. "I've known for some time," Obi-Wan said. "I chose to let you tell me in your own time." Anakin had rehearsed 14 versions of this conversation, and not one of them had started here. He had been braced for the institutional response, for the careful, disciplined disappointment, for the code invoked with regret, for the specific grief of a man who loved him trying to explain why the Order's rules existed, and why they couldn't simply be set aside for love, even his love, even this. He had been prepared for all of that. He had prepared arguments against it. I know. I waited. He had to recalibrate entirely. How long was what came out? Long enough that it stopped being a question of whether and became a question of when. A small pause. You are not as unreadable as you believe, Anakin. Not to me. Something in his chest went sideways in a way that was not unpleasant. He pressed his hands harder against his knees. He had 14 more things to say, and he needed to say all of them before the gratitude undid his capacity for speech. There's more, he said. I assumed there was. He told him everything. He told it chronologically, the way he had planned. The visions first. The shape and the frequency of them. The way they had arrived with a cinematic completeness that he had. Until the vault, simply accepted as the Force's way of delivering unbearable information. He told him about the months of terror, the mounting conviction that Padme would die, and that there was nothing a Jedi Knight could do about it, that the Order's knowledge didn't extend to this, and its rules wouldn't permit the knowledge that did. He told it plainly, without drama, and watched Obi-Wan's face move through careful listening into something sharper and more alert. Then he told him about the vault. He laid it out methodically, the healing texts, the bond, the warmth he had felt through it instead of the death the visions promised. The Sith methodology section, the resonant contamination technique, the timeline he had drawn, with every conversation and every nightmare mapped against each other until the pattern became impossible to mistake. He told him about the Vision Codex, the case studies, the documented markers of vision corruption that matched what had been happening to him point for point. He set it in front of Obi-Wan the way he had set the codex on the reading surface in the vault. Flat, complete, letting it be what it was. When he finished, Obi-Wan was quiet for a moment. His cup sat cooling in his hand. He was looking at the floor, not as someone who cannot meet your eyes, but as someone who needs a surface that is not demanding anything of him while he thinks. Anakin, he said finally. When did the visions start? 8 months ago, after the Cato Nemoidia campaign. And Palpatine, when did he first offer to discuss alternative approaches to Padme's situation? 7 months ago. In passing, a comment about Jedi limitations. Obi-Wan set down his cup very carefully. He looked up. Right, he said. The single word carried something in it that was not quite anger and not quite grief, something colder and more considered than either. We need Yoda. The garden occupied a small interior courtyard at the temple's center, visible from none of the exterior windows. Accessible through a corridor that most Padawans never found, and most knights used only for the meditative walk between one commitment and the next. It was barely large enough to deserve the name, a square of sky overhead, 4 walls of temple stone, and in the space between them, plants. Dozens of them, ranging from low ground, hugging things with leaves the color of old copper to tall, reed-like growths that moved in the building's air currents as though breathing. Yoda had been tending this garden for the better part of 4 centuries. Some of the plants had been here longer than anyone currently living in the temple. He was crouched at the garden's edge when they arrived, one hand in the soil at the base of something low and silver-leafed, his eyes closed. He did not turn around. He said, in the measured, unhurried cadence of someone finishing a thought before addressing a new one, "Expected you. I did not. But since you coming, I did." Some minutes ago, he opened his eyes. He turned, slowly, and looked at Anakin with an expression that was not readable in any simple way. The profound, practiced attention of a being who had lived long enough that surprise had become a rare and specifically instructive phenomenon. He studied Anakin's face the way the Force lock had studied his presence, reading what was underneath the surface. Then he rose, with the deliberate care of very old bones, and gestured at the stone bench along the garden wall. "Sit," he said. "Both of you. And tell me." Anakin told it again. Shorter this time, Obi-Wan's questions had refined it, compressed the essential structure, and the second telling came out cleaner, the through line clearer. He told Yoda about the visions, the vault, what he had found and what he had concluded. He told him about the timeline. And then, at the end, with the same controlled steadiness he had used throughout, because if he stopped being steady now, he would stop being able to speak at all, he told Yoda about Padme. The marriage. The 3 years. The children coming. Yoda listened without interruption. When it was done, he was quiet for a long time. The silver-leafed plant at the garden's edge moved in the air's slow current. A Padawan class was crossing somewhere on the other side of the wall. He could hear their footsteps, their young voices, the particular unself-conscious noise of people who do not yet know what weight the building they're walking through has seen. Then Yoda exhaled, a slow, considered breath that carried in it something ancient and not entirely comfortable, the sound of a being confronting a mirror he had been carefully not looking into. Failed you. We have. He said it the way a fact is said, without the softening that would have made it easier to hear and less honest. Not perhaps we could have done better or the Council has reflected on its approach. Failed you. Blunt, owned, complete, too bound in rules. Too slow to see the person inside the prophecy. He looked down at the ground for a moment, and then back up at Anakin. And in his eyes was the specific quality of a very old being's genuine remorse, not guilt performing itself, but the real tired thing. A cost. That slowness had. We are sorry for it. Anakin said nothing. He did not trust what his voice would do. This marriage, Yoda continued, and something shifted in the cadence, from the acknowledging of a failure into the making of a decision. Annul it. We will not. Ask you to hide her. We will not. He met Anakin's eyes directly. Protect her. We will. All of us. Obi-Wan added his voice. He spoke quietly and without hesitation, in the tone he used when a thing was simply true, and the only question was the logistics of it. He spoke about the Order adapting. It had adapted before, historically, when the cost of rigidity exceeded the cost of change. He spoke about Padme being under the protection of the Jedi in all practical terms from this moment forward. He spoke about standing beside Anakin in this, not as a concession, but as the conclusion of something he had been thinking through for a long time. Anakin had been in this garden before. He had never stayed long. It was too still, too patient, too much like a place that required you to be honest about what you were carrying. Today the stillness felt different. The 400-year-old plants moved their silver leaves in the slow air, and the sky above the courtyard was the pale, flat blue of a Coruscant morning, and the 3 of them sat in a circle that felt, improbably, like something being repaired. Yoda put one hand on Anakin's knee. His hand was very small and very warm, and the gesture was so simple it almost undid everything Anakin had been holding together. Strong, you have always been, the old master said quietly. But strength, you did not need today. Courage to ask for help. That, hardest of all. A Jedi Master. Truly you are now. Anakin looked at the ground. He pressed the heel of his mechanical hand against his knee and breathed through his nose and kept his face still and his eyes dry through a sustained act of will that cost him more than the Cato Nemoidia Bridge had cost him. He managed it. Barely, by a margin he would not have bet on. There is one more thing, he said, when he was certain of his voice again. Obi-Wan's stillness went very still. The Chancellor. Anakin kept it precise, operational, the way he had kept the timeline, as evidence, not accusation. The visions were sourced from outside me. The Codex documents a specific technique. The markers all point to someone in sustained proximity who is working through the dark side. He looked at Yoda. I need you to consider the possibility that the man sitting in the Chancellor's office is the Sith Lord we have been looking for. Yoda closed his eyes. Obi-Wan said nothing. His stillness had become its own kind of speech. The silver-leafed plant moved. Tomorrow, Yoda said, after a long moment that the garden held around them without apology. The full council. And then, his eyes opened, and in them was something that was neither fear nor certainty, but something that sat between them. older than either. Ready, we will be. The invitation arrived by courier at mid-morning. A physical card. Cream-colored, heavy stock. The kind of material that announced itself as significant before you read a word on it. The Chancellor's personal seal pressed into the lower corner. 2 seats at the Galaxy's Opera House, this evening, the Mon Calamari Ballet's final performance of their Coruscant residency. A handwritten note at the bottom in Palpatine's precise slanted script. I find these evenings clarify the mind considerably. I hope you'll join me. Anakin read it twice. Then he went to find Obi-Wan. He found him in the Eastern Training Corridor, watching a class of 12-year-olds work through basic Shi-Cho forms with the meditative patience of a man who genuinely finds 12-year-olds attempting Shi-Cho to be one of the more restorative sights available in the temple. Anakin stood beside him and held out the card without comment. Obi-Wan read it. His expression did not change in any way that a stranger would notice. His thumb moved once across the edge of the card, a small, involuntary motion that Anakin recognized as Obi-Wan processing something he did not want to react to visibly. Go, Obi-Wan said. He handed the card back. His eyes stayed on the Padawans. Listen. Learn. Come back. A beat. Anakin waited, knowing there was more. Trust yourself, Obi-Wan said. You know what you know. Let him show you what you already understand. He said nothing else. One of the 12-year-olds dropped her practice saber and looked mortified, and Obi-Wan called gentle correction across the room, and Anakin pocketed the card and left him to it. The Galaxy's Opera House occupied the crown of a tower in the Senate District, whose architecture was designed to make everyone who entered it feel that art was the natural culmination of civilization, and that civilization had been building toward exactly this room. The dome was enormous, large enough that the air inside had its own weather, its own slight coolness at altitude, its own quality of held breath. 1,000 beings in formal dress filled the curved banks of seating below, the specific luminous crowd of people for whom attending things is itself a form of power. The performance space at the dome's center was dark except for the manufactured water light, a technology Anakin had never fully understood, something between holography and actual liquid, that created the shimmering blue-green environment in which the Mon Calamari performers moved. He arrived exactly on time. A Senate usher took him through a side corridor, up 2 levels, and into the Chancellor's private box. Palpatine was already seated. He rose when Anakin entered, the courtesy of a host, unhurried, warm, the gesture of a man for whom good manners were as automatic as breathing. He had always been impeccable at this. In the Chancellor's box, with the city visible through the curved window behind him and the performance space glowing far below, he looked exactly like what he had always appeared to be, an elderly statesman, slight and silver-haired, wearing the years of difficult service with the kind of worn dignity that invites trust. Anakin, he took his hands briefly. I'm so glad you came. Sit, it begins shortly. They sat. Below them the performers were taking their positions, pale, luminous figures in the manufactured water light, their movements already beginning the slow, deliberate preparation of bodies about to make art from difficult things. The music warming beneath the dome was melancholic in the specific way of something that has been beautiful for a long time and knows it. Palpatine spoke about the performers. He spoke about the residency, 6 weeks, unprecedented. The company had never previously left Mon Calamari for this length of time. He spoke about the approaching end of the war, the relief of it, the reconstruction that would follow. He was warm and specific and attentive, asking questions about the council appointment, about how the rank felt now that several days had passed. He was, in every outward particular, exactly what he had always been. Anakin answered. He asked questions in return. He was present, engaged, collegial, and underneath all of it, he was completely still. Below them, the performance began. The Mon Calamari moved through their waterlight like something between swimming and flight, the large, rounded heads catching the manufactured glow, the wide eyes and the fluid limbs creating a quality of motion that was genuinely unlike anything terrestrial. The music built in long, slow waves. The story they were telling, whatever it was, involved separation, Two figures reaching across a distance the medium between them would not allow to close. Anakin watched it and felt the Chancellor watching him. Not visibly. Palpatine's eyes were on the performance, correctly, as a host should be. But the Force, which Anakin had spent 3 days sharpening his awareness of, sitting in the vault's silence working through material that had clarified his perception considerably, the Force told a different story. There was a quality of attention emanating from the man beside him that had nothing to do with the ballet. A precision to it, a directedness, and something else. Something that pressed. Gently, almost imperceptibly the way a tide presses. Not violent, not urgent, but with the patient insistence of something that has all the time it needs. He felt it at the edge of his mind, testing the boundary, looking for the specific frequency of fear that it had learned to find in him over months of practice. Looking for Padme's face, looking for the gray-white of a medical table and a hand going slack. He let it look. He did not let it find anything. In his chest, steady and warm and real, the bond he had formed 3 days ago in the vault held its quiet signal. Padme, in the Senate building on the other side of the district, in a meeting that had been running too long and would run longer, alive and frustrated, and fully, completely present in her own life. The pressing at the edge of his mind found nothing to grip. Palpatine spoke during the first interval. He did it beautifully. Anakin could admit that, the specific craftwork of it. He transitioned from the performance with a naturalness that made the transition invisible, moving through a series of observations about art and mortality, and the peculiar consolation of beauty that led, with the inevitability of something that had been engineered to feel like organic conversation, to the question, "Have you heard the tragedy of Darth Plagueis the Wise?" He said, he thought not. He told it. Anakin had read the Plagueis entry in the restricted Sith historical archive on the second day in the vault. Not as legend, as documented case history, with the academic apparatus of citation and counter-citation that serious scholarship requires. He knew the historical Plagueis. He knew the technique attributed to him, which the archive treated with appropriate skepticism, powerful. Yes, unique. Perhaps not. And certainly not the clean, reliable science that the legend suggested. He knew the fate the legend agreed on, killed in his sleep by his own apprentice. Because the Sith rule of two was not a partnership. It was a mechanism, and Plagueis had forgotten which end of it he was on. He sat and listened to Palpatine tell the story with the still, focused attention of someone reading a document they have already studied, checking it against the version they know, noting the emphases, the omissions, the choices. The story was good. He could see why it worked. The structure of it was almost musical, the slow establishment of Plagueis's power, the careful introduction of what that power could do, the building toward the central offer, which arrived wrapped in the passive voice as though it were simply a fact about the universe rather than a proposition aimed directly at a specific man's specific fear. He could keep the ones he loved from dying. The water light below shifted. The performers regrouped for the second act. Palpatine let the silence breathe. It was timed well. It was the silence of a man who has just said something important and is allowing it to land. He said, "Is it possible to learn this power?" In the canonical shape of this moment, there was an answer. Anakin had spoken it himself, in another version of this night. In a version of himself he had spent 3 days in the vault learning to see clearly, not from a Jedi. 2 words, whispered, barely audible over the music, and in those 2 words a door opening onto everything that followed. He let the silence run. 4 seconds. 5. Below them the second act was beginning, the performers finding their positions in the water light, the music resuming its long, melancholic swell. Palpatine waited with the patience of someone who had been waiting longer than this for more difficult things. "You know," Anakin said, "I spent 3 days in the Jedi archives reading about Plagueis. Something happened in the air beside him. Not visible. Not audible. A quality of stillness that had not been there before." The restricted section, Anakin continued. His voice was pleasant, conversational, the same register he had been using all evening. Master privilege. He looked at the performance below rather than at Palpatine. Remarkable figure. The academic literature is surprisingly thorough, cross-referenced with several other Sith methodological texts from the same period. A brief pause. The accounts agree fairly consistently on his fate. His apprentice killed him. In his sleep. He turned, finally, and looked at the Chancellor. The apprentice went by another name afterward. Darth Sidious, I believe. Below them, the Mon Calamari performers moved through their waterlight in long, sweeping arcs. The music swelled. Palpatine's face did not change. This was the extraordinary thing. The thing that even now, knowing what he knew, Anakin had to acknowledge as a feat of almost inhuman self-mastery. Not a flicker, not a microtension in the muscles around his eyes, not a fractional shift in the angle of his shoulders. The warmth on his face stayed exactly as warm as it had been. The slight smile stayed exactly as slight. The posture stayed exactly as open and relaxed and grandfatherly as it had been for the entire evening. But the pressing at the edge of Anakin's mind stopped. Completely, instantly, cut off as cleanly as a signal interrupted. There one moment, gone the next. And the absence of it was itself a confirmation more complete than anything visible could have been. An innocent man, surprised by a strange and unfounded accusation, does not stop reaching. Whatever had been reaching had known, in the instant Anakin spoke, that there was nothing left to reach for. Murky legend, Palpatine said warmly. The historical record becomes quite unreliable in that era. The archives have never fully agreed on the details. He chuckled, a sound precisely calibrated to indicate gentle amusement at scholarly excess. I find the story compelling precisely because of its ambiguity. The lesson, I've always felt, is less about the specific figures than about the nature of course, Anakin said. Remarkable story regardless. He smiled. Palpatine smiled. Below them, the two Mon Calamari figures at the center of the performance reached again across the distance the waterlight held between them, and the music went somewhere quiet and irresolvable, and the 1,000 beings in the seats below watched and felt, in the way audiences feel, that something important was happening that they could not quite name. The performance ended. The audience rose in appreciation, the sound of it filling the dome. Anakin stood. He thanked the Chancellor for the evening with the warmth and sincerity of a man who has genuinely enjoyed himself. He shook the offered hand, firm, unhurried, completely normal. He said he hoped they might do this again when the war's end allowed for more such evenings. Palpatine agreed it was a fine idea. He called Anakin my boy, in parting. And Anakin received it with the easy grace of someone who no longer needed the phrase to mean anything. He walked out through the glittering lobby with the departing crowd moving around him, voices and formal clothing and the warm, indifferent press of 1,000 people who had spent an evening watching art and were now returning to the rest of their lives. He moved through it, without hurrying. He emerged onto the steps of the opera house and the Coruscant night wrapped around him, the smell of the city, the traffic streams blazing their rivers of light at every altitude, the vast indifferent beauty of a world that contained right now 12 million stories of equal complexity to his own. He stood on the steps for one breath. He had been there. He had listened. He had confirmed, with a precision the Codex would have recognized as methodologically sound, the one thing that mattered tonight. He had not reacted. He had not confronted. He had played the role until the role was done, and then he had stood up and left. And behind him in that private box, he knew. Something ancient and cold and very patient was recalculating. He reached into his robe, found his comlink, pressed the contact that Obi-Wan would answer regardless of the hour. The archives were right, he said, when the line opened. Meet at the temple. Bring Mace. He descended the steps into the city, hands easy at his sides, and did not look back. Behind him, in the box above the emptying dome, Palpatine stood at the curved window and watched the performers below begin to disassemble the waterlight apparatus, the careful, methodical work of people who built beauty for a living and understood it to be temporary. The warm smile was gone. The slight stoop was gone. What stood at the window was not the Chancellor of the Galactic Republic. What stood at the window was calculating the hours. The box filled with the sound of the dome's ventilation, the deep, cold breath of a large building exhaling the heat of 1,000 bodies. And in that sound, if you had the ear for it, was something that had not been there before this evening, the first note of genuine urgency in a plan that had run. Until tonight, exactly on schedule. He had less time than he had thought. He began composing the next phase. The inner sanctum of the council chamber looked different at midnight. Anakin had been in this room 100 times and had never seen it like this. Stripped of ceremony. Stripped of the formal arrangement of 12 masters and 12 seats that gave the space its particular gravity. Tonight there were 5 of them, seated without the protocol of assigned positions, and the room without its ritual felt raw somehow, closer to the bone of what it actually was. A small circular space at the top of a very tall building where people responsible for impossible things came to decide what to do next. The city glowed through every window. No lamps had been lit inside. The light from below was sufficient, and the darkness suited the hour. Mace Windu sat at the window directly opposite the door, his elbows on his knees, his hands loosely clasped. He had been told the outline by Obi-Wan on the walk up, enough to understand the shape of the evening, not enough for the detail, and his face held the particular quality Anakin had only seen on it twice before, the absolute stillness of a man whose considerable capacity for decisive action has been temporarily suspended by the need to hear everything before he acts on any of it. Ki-Adi-Mundi's hologram occupied the seat to the left, his image slightly blue-edged and flickering at the margins where the encryption held its edges, present from the outer rim, the delay in his signal giving his reactions a faint, ghostly lag. Yoda sat with his Geimer stick across his knees and his eyes already closed, already reading the force currents in the room the way a river reader reads water. Obi-Wan stood near the door. He had been standing near the door since they arrived. Anakin understood this, the positioning of a man who wants all exits in his peripheral vision while he thinks. Anakin stood at the center and delivered it. He had refined it twice now, once for Obi-Wan, once for Yoda, and the third telling had the clean, load-bearing economy of a report that knows its own essential structure. He moved through it without editorializing. The visions, their frequency, their quality, the markers he had identified in the Vision Codex, the vault, what the healing texts had shown him, what the bond had confirmed, the real-time warmth of Padem alive and well against the manufactured certainty of the nightmare, the methodology section, the resonant contamination technique, the timeline he had drawn, the geography of the manipulation assembling itself into something that only had one possible center, and then the opera house. He gave that section the most precision. The pressing at the edge of his mind during the Plagueis story, the directionality of it, the instant it stopped when he said the name Sidious. He described it as a sensor reading, not an accusation. He presented it the way you present a trajectory calculation. Here is the data. Here is what the data means. Here is the conclusion the data requires. Mace listened without interrupting. His eyes never left Anakin's face. When it was done, Mace asked 3 questions. Sharp, sequential, each one aimed at a different structural element of the case. The first about the vault's documentation of resonant contamination and how Anakin had verified it against his own experience. The second about what specifically had happened in the Force at the Opera House when Anakin spoke. The third about the timeline's most anomalous data point. Anakin answered each one without hesitation. The answers were not rehearsed, they were simply known. He had been living inside this evidence for 3 days. Mace was quiet. Then he said, "I owe you an apology, Skywalker." It landed differently than Anakin expected. Not because it was unwelcome. It was not unwelcome. It was one of the more extraordinary sentences Mace Windu had ever directed at him. And he had been receiving Mace Windu sentences for a decade, but because of its texture. It was not the apology of a man performing institutional accountability. It was too direct for that. Too stripped of the qualifying language that turns an apology into a position paper. We should have trusted you with that vault years ago. The information was there. You were there. We put a door between them and told ourselves it was wisdom. A brief pause. We won't make that mistake twice. Anakin said nothing. There was nothing adequate to say, and Mace was not waiting for a response. He was moving forward already, the way he always moved, directly toward the problem that needed solving. Yoda opened his eyes. "Move we must," he said. The Geimer stick shifted slightly across his knees, but not as he expects. He looked around the circle of them, his gaze resting on each face for a moment with the particular quality of someone reading what is not quite being said. Expected, we would be. Sidious has spent 30 years waiting for Jedi to come at him directly, on his terms, in his moment of choosing. Impulsive, the Sith want us. Reactive, give him that, we must not. Ki-Adi-Mundi's hologram leaned forward, the signal delay making the motion slightly archaic. What assets does he have that we haven't accounted for? The clone army, Anakin said. That's what we haven't accounted for. He had been thinking about this on the walk from the opera house, turning the problem over, and the clone army was where it kept arriving. 30 years of planning and he has a weapon we don't fully understand yet. The Fives incident last year, the inhibitor chip investigation that was shut down before it concluded. If there's an encoded kill order in every clone's chip, he doesn't need to fight us directly. He just needs to get one signal out to the right frequency, and the Grand Army turns on every Jedi in the field simultaneously. The room was quiet for a moment, with the specific weight of a thing being understood for the first time by the people who needed to understand it. Obi-Wan said, "From the door, how do we stop the signal?" He found Rex in the temple hangar at the 3rd hour, not because Rex was supposed to be there, he wasn't, by any formal schedule, but because Rex was always in the hangar when there was nothing requiring him elsewhere, performing the quiet, methodical maintenance of equipment that didn't strictly need maintaining. Which Anakin had long understood was the way Rex processed the things he couldn't talk about. He was crouched over the engine housing of a lot gunship with a hydrospanner, and the focused, private expression of a man who is thinking very hard about something that is not the engine. He heard Anakin coming and didn't look up. General, Captain, Anakin crouched beside him. Not across from him, beside him, in the shared posture of two people who have worked at close quarters long enough that hierarchy is a formality they retain for the sake of the people watching. "I need a minute." Rex set the hydrospanner down. He looked at Anakin with the dark, steady eyes that Anakin had learned over 3 years to read as clearly as most people's faces. Rex's eyes were expressive in inverse proportion to the rest of him. Everything the man didn't say lived there, catalogued and available if you knew what to look for. Right now they held attention, readiness, and underneath both of those, a specific quality of waiting that Anakin recognized as the waiting of someone who has been expecting a conversation and is relieved it has finally arrived. "The Chancellor is a Sith Lord," Anakin said. "He has a mechanism, a signal he can broadcast to every clone in the Grand Army simultaneously. It's connected to the inhibitor chips. When it goes out, every clone trooper in the field will receive an order to execute their Jedi commanders." Rex was very still. "Fives knew," Anakin said. "What he found, what he tried to tell us before he died. He was right, all of it." Rex's hand moved. A small motion, involuntary, the fingers of his right hand rising briefly toward his temple, toward the location of the chip, and then stopping. He held the pause. His jaw was set. His eyes were doing something complicated and controlled, and Anakin let it happen without trying to manage it. Because Rex deserved the full weight of this moment, and rushing him through it would be a kind of theft. "Tell me what you need," General, Rex said. His voice was absolutely steady. That steadiness cost something. Anakin could see the cost of it, the effort underneath the military register. But it held. "The Senate Communications Hub," Anakin said. "There's a secondary encrypted channel installed in the relay architecture, Kaminoan contractors 3 years ago, the Chancellor's personal authorization. That's how the signal reaches the chips. I need you to take your most trusted men and get to that hub before we go to Palpatine's office. When I send the signal, I need you to destroy it. All of it. Primary relay, secondary, tertiary, everything it could use to reach the clones." Rex looked at him steadily. "And if the signal goes out before we get there, it won't. We move at the same time, you to the hub, us to the office. The moment we enter, you destroy the relay. There won't be a gap." A long pause. The hangar breathed around them. The distant sound of the city coming through the bay doors. The low hum of powered-down ships. The smell of engine oil and recycled air. "I heard Fives," Rex said. "Before he died. I sat with him in that medical bay for 4 hours, and I heard everything he said, and I have been thinking about it every day since. He touched the side of his own head again, and this time the hand stayed there for a moment before dropping. I never stopped thinking about it. His eyes met Anakin's. How many men do I need? 6. Your best. I know who. He picked up the hydrospanner, set it down again without using it. The men I'm thinking of, they'll do this because I'm asking. They won't know everything. But they'll do it. I know, Anakin said. That's why I'm asking you. By the time the sky outside the temple began its slow shift from black to the deep bruised blue of pre-dawn, the architecture of it was complete. The 501st would secure the Senate building's exterior, approach routes, egress points, the landing platforms on levels 12 through 19. Rex's unit of 6 would take the communications hub. The timing was absolute. Rex's team needed to be in position at the hub before the 4 Masters entered Palpatine's office. Not simultaneously, not shortly before, with confirmation of position sent by comlink, and only then would the Jedi move. The 4 Masters, Mace, Anakin, Obi-Wan, Yoda, no larger. A larger team meant more variables. More chances for Palpatine's surveillance network to register an anomaly in movement patterns before they reached the door. 4 people could walk through the Senate district at dawn without attracting notice. 12 couldn't. Ki-Adi-Mundi's hologram had asked about additional council members. Surely more masters meant a more decisive. More masters means more noise, Mace said. With a flatness that ended the discussion. We 4 are enough. Obi-Wan raised the honest problem. He raised it in the plain, direct way he raised all honest problems. Without dramatizing it, and without minimizing it. They did not know what Palpatine could do. The Sith had been hidden for 1,000 years. There were no combat records, no tactical assessments, no documentation of what Darth Sidious looked like when the mask was gone, and he was fighting without the constraint of his performance. They were walking toward the most powerful dark side practitioner in living memory, with no intelligence on his capabilities. Then we go in together, Anakin said. He had been the one to raise the problem the night before, and he was the one to answer it now, all 4 of us. And we trust each other. Obi-Wan looked at him. Yes, he said simply. We do. There was one thing left. He left the temple as the pre-dawn light was beginning to define the edges of things, the tops of buildings separating from sky, the traffic streams thinning to their quietest hour. He moved through the city with the familiarity of a man who has walked these streets in every condition the Republic can generate, and he arrived at the apartment and let himself in with the particular care of someone entering a room that contains a sleeping person they do not want to wake. But Padme was awake. She was at the window with a cup of something warm, watching the city begin to light itself, and she turned when she heard him and looked at his face the way she always looked at his face when he came home at unusual hours, reading it, because she was very good at reading things, and because 7 years of loving him had given her a fluency in the specific dialect of what his face did when he was carrying something significant. She didn't ask the large questions. She asked the true one. How bad? It ends today, he said. One way or another. Today. She was quiet for a moment. She looked at him with the steady, clear attention of a woman who had been in politics since she was 14, and had learned the difference between the fear that paralyzes and the fear that sharpens. She set down her cup. She crossed the room. She put both hands on his face, her thumbs at his cheekbones, the way she held him when she needed him to actually hear her, rather than just listen. Come home, she said. Not be careful. Not I'm afraid. 2 words that contained both of those things and were stronger than either. I promise, he said. They walked through the Coruscant morning 4 abreast. Not hurrying. Not in the temple to Senate sprint of an emergency response. Not with the taut, forward-leaning urgency of a strike team burning toward its target. They walked at the pace of 4 people who have made their decision and have nothing left to prove to themselves about it. The morning crowds moved around them, market stalls opening their fronts, delivery vehicles settling at loading docks. A school group in matching tunics filing across an intersection with the organized chaos of children who have been told to stay together and are trying. The ordinary, irreplaceable, entirely unaware world, going about the business of being itself. Mace walked on the left, his robe moving with the particular settled weight of someone who has put everything else down. Yoda moved with his Geimer stick on the right, each step deliberate, unhurried, the 9 centuries of him as present in the way he occupied space as anything else about him. Obi-Wan walked at Anakin's shoulder, close enough that their arms were nearly touching, which was not something Obi-Wan did by accident. Anakin did not speak. He listened to the city instead, the hawker calling the morning price of something from 3 stalls over, the mechanical exhale of a transit platform descending, a child laughing somewhere above them on a residential balcony, the sound of it carrying down through the warm air of the morning with the specific bright quality of a child who has not yet learned to be careful about being happy. The Senate building rose ahead of them. They walked toward it, 4 figures in Jedi robes, in the ordinary Coruscant morning, carrying the weight of what came next through a world that did not yet know it was about to change. The corridor outside Palpatine's office was 40 meters of polished stone and careful silence. It had been designed, like everything in the Republic Executive Building, to communicate the weight of what happened here. The ceilings high enough to make a person feel appropriately small, the walls dressed in the deep warm stone of a structure that intended to outlast everyone inside it, the lighting arranged to fall in a way that was flattering to neither individual nor flaw. Republic insignia carved in relief at intervals, the flags of member systems hanging in the still air. Everything composed, everything intentional, everything suggesting that the business conducted beyond these walls was the business of history and should be treated accordingly. The 4 Jedi walked through it without breaking stride. Anakin felt the Force move around them as they walked, the particular quality it had when 4 master-level presences moved together in shared purpose, something that was less like power and more like weather, a pressure change that sensitive beings in the vicinity would feel without being able to name. The Senate staffers in the outer offices looked up from their terminals as they passed. Several looked again. No one spoke. The red uniformed guards flanked the tall doors at the corridor's end, 6 of them, in the formal arrangement of a Chancellor's security detail that was more ceremonial than tactical under ordinary conditions. These were not ordinary conditions, and the guards, to their credit, recognized it. Something in the bearing of the 4 approaching figures communicated very clearly that the ordinary protocols were not the relevant framework today. One guard stepped forward. He was senior. The posture and the coloring of his armor said so. He raised a hand, not aggressively, the gesture of a professional performing his function. Jedi Masters. The Chancellor is in a private, step aside, Mace said. This is a matter of Jedi concern. His voice was not raised. It did not need to be. It carried the specific quality that Mace Windu's voice carried when he had moved beyond persuasion and was simply informing, the flatness of a fact being delivered. The guard read it. 2 of his colleagues read it behind him. All 3 stepped aside. The other 3 did not. Their hands went to their sidearms, professional, coordinated, the training of men who had rehearsed this particular escalation many times. Anakin felt the decision in the Force before it was visible in their bodies. 3 blasters clearing holsters in a tight simultaneous motion, the muzzles coming up toward. 4 Jedi moved. Not in the choreographed, dramatic way of the holodramas, not with the cinematic grandeur that the setting seemed to invite. It was fast and careful, and very quiet. 8 seconds, 4 precise Force-assisted disarmaments. 3 guards sitting against the corridor wall, looking somewhat bewildered and entirely uninjured. The blasters in a neat pile on the floor. And the 501st soldiers that Rex had positioned at the corridor's far end already moving to secure the outer offices. No one was hurt. No alarm had sounded. The door was in front of them. Mace pressed it open. Palpatine stood at his desk. He had not been sitting. This was the first thing Anakin registered. He was standing behind the desk. Not in the posture of a man who had risen in surprise at unexpected visitors, but in the posture of a man who had been standing for some time. Waiting. The light through the great windows behind him was the gold of full morning now, the city blazing at every altitude, and it put him in silhouette for a moment as they entered. A slight, silver-haired figure in Chancellor's robes against a sky full of light. Mas Amedda was not present. That was the second thing. Palpatine's eyes moved across the 4 of them in sequence. It took less than 2 seconds. Mace first, the expression, the absolute settled conviction in it. Obi-Wan, the precise, contained readiness. Anakin, and here the gaze paused, fractionally, the length of a single breath, and something passed through it that was not quite recognition, because recognition implies surprise, and this was not that. It was closer to confirmation. Then Yoda, small and still at the rear, staff in hand, and whatever internal calculation was running behind Palpatine's eyes completed itself at the sight of him. He took in the whole picture. He held it. He weighed his options. Anakin could not see this process, but he could feel it in the Force. The way you feel the moment before weather changes. A pressure shift. A decision being made about what form to take. Then, he made his choice. Mace stepped forward. His voice was precise and unhurried. The voice of a man who has prepared this sentence and intends for each word to carry its full weight. Sheev Palpatine. You are under arrest by order of the Jedi Council. The charges are conspiracy against the Galactic Republic, the criminal application of Sith influence upon members of the Republic Senate, and 30 years of sustained deception carried out against the citizens and institutions of this government. You will accompany us to the temple, where a full tribunal will, the warmth, evaporated. It did not fade. It did not transition. It simply ceased. The way a light ceases when the power is cut. Completely. Instantly. Leaving behind a quality of cold that was not the absence of warmth, but its opposite. Something active. Something that had been there all along underneath the performance, and was now no longer bothering to hide. The slight stoop straightened. The soft, avuncular curve of the shoulders resolved into something different. Older, harder, carrying in its angles the accumulated weight of a being who had made himself into what he was through choices that each required choosing again every day for 30 years. The voice dropped 2 full registers. You chose them. He was looking at Anakin. Only at Anakin, as though the other 3 were furniture. Not accusation, something worse than accusation. Something with grief's architecture but none of grief's warmth. The shape of loss, inhabited by something that had never actually felt it. After everything I showed you, everything I prepared for you. The yellow eyes that replaced the pale blue ones were ancient and cold and very, very awake. Then you are already lost. Anakin met his gaze. He had been meeting it for 15 years. He knew every version of this face, or had thought he did. He did not look away. I chose myself, he said. I think that was always the point. Something moved in Palpatine's expression at that. Fast, quickly suppressed, gone before it could be named. Then Mace resumed the sentence that had been interrupted, his voice steady, carrying the full procedural weight of what he was saying. You will stand before a tribunal, and the full evidence will be. The robes moved. Both hilts were drawn in a single motion, one from each hand, emerging from the folds of the Chancellor's robes with the ease of something practiced 10,000 times in private. The curved first hilt, and a second one that none of them had seen before, a weapon that had been a secret even from his own apprentices, kept for a last resort that he had hoped never to need. 2 crimson blades ignited simultaneously, filling the office with red light, and the sound of them, the deep, particular hum of ancient crystals in ancient housings. A pitch lower and rougher than any blade in the room had encountered before, made something in the Force recoil. 4 lightsabers answered. Blue, blue, purple, green. The green one rose from the head of a Geimer stick. Because Yoda's saber had always been his second surprise, and the sight of it still had the quality of something that violated the expected order of things. Palpatine did not wait for them to arrange themselves. The Force lightning was not aimed. That was what Anakin understood later. In the immediate moment, it was simply everywhere. Erupting from both the Chancellor's hands simultaneously in a sustained roiling discharge that had no single target because it didn't need one. It was a declaration. A statement of scale. The desk took it first and came apart in a single detonation. The heavy mahogany and steel construction that had hosted 30 years of Republic governance, reduced in 1 second to constituent pieces. The windows behind him spiderwebbed from the concussive pressure of the discharge, not shattered, held together by their reinforcement, but cracked through in every direction. The air became charged. Metallic, wrong. Mace was already moving. The Va pad engaged. Anakin could feel it. The specific quality of Form 7 activating, Mace's dark side attunement switching on like a current finding a ground, his purple blade becoming a conduit for the very energy being thrown at him. This was what Va pad was for. This was the only form that could do this. And Mace had spent 20 years making it his, and it showed. The lightning that struck his blade redirected, grounded, converted from a fence into part of the circuit that fed back into Mace's own attack. Obi-Wan flanked left. Anakin flanked right. Yoda moved to the center of the room's force dimension and opened his hands, and the debris field that the exploded desk had created. Spinning fragments of hardwood, metal fittings, glass from a shattered case, slowed, sorted, settled, removed from the equation with a casual authority that would have been remarkable in a being half his age. The office was gone in 20 seconds. It was simply gone. The space that had been a carefully composed room for receiving the most powerful people in the Republic was now a war zone. Its appointments destroyed, its careful lighting replaced by the red and purple and blue and green of ignited blades, and the 4 Jedi and the Sith Lord they had come to arrest were spreading through it the way a fight spreads when the space can no longer contain it. The wall to the corridor gave. They spilled through into a wider space, the executive suite's receiving hall, larger. With a higher ceiling, the flags of the member system still hanging in their rows, serene and indifferent, while below them something that would rewrite the galaxy's next 1,000 years tore through the furniture. Palpatine moved. He was extraordinary. Anakin had known this, had told the others, had presented it as a factual component of the operational briefing. He is the most dangerous combatant you have never seen, and knowing it did nothing to diminish the visceral shock of seeing it. He fought with 2 blades and a precision that had nothing young about it, nothing improvised, nothing reactive. Every motion was the culmination of a decision made several moves ago. He was always where the next thing would be. He moved through the Force the way someone moves through a room they have been in 10,000 times, without hesitation, without the fractional lag of needing to assess, with the terrible fluency of someone for whom violence had become a first language. His first real attack bypassed Mace entirely. He went for Obi-Wan, a sudden pivot. A rotation that brought 1 crimson blade at Obi-Wan's guard from an angle that Soresu was built for but barely, the attack carrying in it the specific intelligence of a combatant who had assessed each opponent in the first 5 seconds and understood that the one most dangerous to his long-term position was not the strongest, but the one who thought most clearly under pressure. A Sith who removes the thinking disrupts the team. Obi-Wan's blade came up, caught it, deflected it, a technically flawless defensive response that cost him a step backward and positioned him against the wall. Mace interposed. The purple blade and the dual crimson sang against each other, and the sound of it was nothing like lightsaber combat at a comfortable fictional distance. It was immediate and tremendous, the impact of each contact reverberating through the floor, the forced discharge of blade on blade at this intensity rippling outward and pressing against the walls. Anakin came in from the right flank and brought the full weight of Gemso, Form 5's aggressive counter, every strike using the kinetic energy of the opponent's attack redirected and amplified. And for a moment they had Palpatine pressed between 2 directions. He was still smiling. Not the warm, grandfatherly smile. Something older. The smile of a being who had been waiting for a worthy problem for 30 years, and had finally found one. Force lightning cracked laterally across the room, not from his hands, from the Force itself, drawn through him. Grounding through the metal floor fittings and leaping to the light fixtures and arcing back, and the receiving hall's ceiling cracked down the center, and the flags of 60 member systems swayed and fell in the sudden hot wind of the discharge, and somewhere in the building's infrastructure a power conduit screamed and went dark. The executive suite of the Supreme Chancellor of the Galactic Republic caught the light of its own burning, and beneath them, 30 meters below in the Senate building's communication hub, Captain Rex's comlink received a signal. He looked at his 6 brothers. They looked at him. "Now," he said. The floor gave way at the 3rd minute. Not all of it, a section, maybe 8 meters across, the stone and durasteel composite of the executive suite's lower level finally surrendering to what had been done to it in the minutes preceding. It went in stages, First the creak of something structural complaining, then the sharp, definitive crack of a support giving entirely, then the drop. A sudden, stomach-removing fall of 4 meters into the Senate building's upper gallery, the 4 Jedi and the Sith Lord, and the continuing argument between them relocating without ceremony into the grand curved space above the Senate chamber itself. The gallery was empty. This hour, this morning, no Senate session was in progress. The benches were dark, the repulsor lift platforms in their docked positions. The vast circular space of the chamber below lit only by its standby lighting, a pale, cold blue that turned everything inside it into shadow and suggestion. Palpatine landed on the gallery rail and stood there for one breath, balanced on 6 centimeters of polished stone 40 meters above the chamber floor, 2 red blades burning, perfectly still. And the stillness of it was worse than the movement had been. The movement you could track. The stillness meant he was deciding something. Then he decided it, and leapt. He went straight down. A freefall that no human being should have survived, and that he converted, at its apex, into a force-augmented descent that deposited him on the chamber floor with the casual precision of a stone placed by a deliberate hand. The blue standby lighting caught him from below and made him into something that the Senate had never seen from this angle. Not the beloved Chancellor in his chair on the elevated platform, not the reassuring face of continuity and wisdom. Something ancient and without apology, standing at the center of the Republic's most sacred deliberative space with red light burning from both hands. The 4 Jedi came down behind him. Obi-Wan and Mace used the gallery supports, controlled descents, fast. Anakin dropped without assistance, the force cushioning the landing to nothing, the impact absorbed so completely that he straightened from it without breaking stride. Yoda descended last, and what Yoda did could not strictly be called falling. It was more like the air simply agreeing to lower him, slowly, at his own pace. His Geimer stick tucked under one arm and his eyes already tracking the chamber's geometry with the calm assessment of a being who has fought in worse rooms. The Senate chamber at standby was a specific kind of enormous. The circular architecture amplified sound unpredictably, carrying certain frequencies across the space while swallowing others. The hundreds of repulsor lift platforms hovered in their docked positions around the circumference, each one a potential obstacle or terrain feature, depending on what the next minutes required. The ceiling was far enough above that looking up induced a mild vertigo. The floor was wide enough that 4 combatants could spread across it without crowding. Palpatine did not wait for them to assess. He came at Mace with both blades in a combination that Anakin had never seen. A sequence that began as Makashi, the elegant dueling form, and converted mid-motion into something older, something that predated the modern forms entirely, that had the quality of a tradition practiced in secret for so long it had evolved past its origins into something new. The footwork was minimal. The blade angles were extreme. It was the fighting style of someone who had never needed to train against other practitioners, because there had never been another practitioner at his level to train against. Mace met it with Vapad, and the contact between them was immediate and total, purple and red grinding against each other in a sustained bind, the force discharge of it visible. A faint luminescence at the point of contact where the dark energy Mace was channeling back met the dark energy Palpatine was pouring forward. It was, in a technical sense, the most perfectly matched combat exchange in the history of the Order. 2 beings with exactly the right weapons for each other, in exactly the right configuration for neither to have an immediate advantage. Anakin took the left flank. Obi-Wan took the right. This was not discussed. It had not been planned in any specific sense during the briefing. It was the product of 3 years of fighting in the same theaters against the same caliber of opposition. A shorthand so established it had passed below the level of conscious communication into something that functioned more like instinct. A shift of weight, a glance, and the 2 of them were spreading into flanking positions with the seamless coordination of a mechanism whose components knew their function. Palpatine felt the flanking before it was complete. He rotated, one blade disengaging from the bind with Mace in a controlled withdrawal, the other sweeping outward in a long guard that forced Anakin to redirect his attack. The disengage was so precise that Mace, expecting resistance, stumbled forward into space, and Palpatine used the half-second of Mace's recovery to push through the force, a compact, focused strike, Not the broad kinetic wave of an untrained force push, but something more surgical. A directed pressure aimed at Obi-Wan's blade arm. Obi-Wan's Soresu absorbed it. Barely, he took a step back. His grip adjusted, his guard reformed. But the step backward was a step toward the chamber wall, and Palpatine's positional intelligence was such that he had already registered it as an asset. A combatant with a wall behind him is a combatant with one fewer option. He filed it. "You feel it, don't you, Anakin?" He was talking while fighting. This was, Anakin understood immediately, not a sign of distraction. It was the opposite. It was a Sith using every available weapon simultaneously. The twin blades kept moving, kept requiring response, kept imposing their terrible geometry on everyone in the room, and the voice came from behind them like a second attack, aimed at a different target. The power. It's right there. You've always had it, more of it than any living being should. You just needed permission to use it without apology. Anakin attacked into the speech rather than listening to it. A hard diagonal cut from Gemso, followed immediately by the pommel strike that the form built in as its second beat. Palpatine parried both with one blade and used the other to force a counter Anakin had to step wide to avoid. "You're carrying yourself differently," Palpatine continued, and something in his voice shifted, the recruitment pitch becoming something that was almost, disturbingly, analytical, curious, genuinely curious. Something changed. This week, I think. Before the Opera House. A brief pause, filled with the sound of blades. The vault. He had worked it out. Of course he had. "It doesn't matter," Anakin said. "It matters enormously," Palpatine said, and attacked. What followed was the worst 30 seconds of the engagement. Palpatine abandoned the three-front management and concentrated everything on Anakin, both blades. Full power. The economical precision of his style replaced by something rawer and more direct. A decision to simply overwhelm. He was not reckless. Even here, even now, there was no recklessness in him. But the calculation had shifted. Anakin was the variable he hadn't accounted for, the weapon that had turned in his hand. And the Sith Lord's instinct was to understand things by breaking them open. Anakin held. He held through 6 exchanges that should have broken his guard, feeling each impact through his arms and into his shoulders, the full force-augmented weight of a Sith Lord's offense transmitted through blade contact into bone. He held because Gemso was built for this, built for absorbing punishment and converting it, built for the opponent who brings more physical power and needs to have that power redirected rather than matched. He held, and he waited, and he looked for the pattern. It was on the 9th exchange that Yoda moved. Palpatine had, in his concentration on Anakin, reduced his force dimension management. The telekinetic pressure he had been applying to keep debris in motion as passive interference. The Senate chamber's standby equipment, the small maintenance units docked near the floor, the detached railing section that had come down with them from the gallery, that management lapsed by a fraction. Yoda collected it all. Not weaponized. Not hurled. Simply removed from the equation, lifted, sorted, set aside, the chamber floor cleared of debris with a few seconds of unhurried force work that required no visible effort and made the space sharply, suddenly simpler. Palpatine felt it and redirected his attention, and in that redirection his offensive on Anakin faltered by a single beat. Mace came through the gap. His Va-Pad had been building its charge across the entire engagement, every parry a collection, every deflection a deposit, the form functioning as it was designed to, a capacitor for dark side energy, storing what it received, waiting for the moment when the stored charge exceeded the opponent's capacity to absorb its return. He came through the gap Palpatine's lapse created, and hit the Sith Lord's guard with the full accumulated return, and for the first time in the engagement, Darth Sidious was pushed backward. 2 steps. No more. But 2 steps was real. 2 steps was evidence that the direction of the thing could change. Palpatine reassembled, his guard reformed, but his breathing had changed. Anakin could hear it now, the slight new labor in it, the first sign that the body housing all this ancient cultivated power had physical limits like any other body. He began to pour more power into the lightning. The first sustained discharge came from both hands simultaneously, and went not at the Jedi but at the chamber itself. The repulsor lift platforms on the chamber's near side struck in sequence, their containment fields detonating, and their platforms falling in a cascade of sequential impacts that shook the floor and filled the air with the smell of burned systems and sent a wave of concussive pressure across the space. Obi-Wan was the one it caught. He had moved to cover Anakin's left during the Mace exchange, and the platform fragment that came off the third detonation in the cascade was not aimed. It was simply debris in motion, and he was in its path, and his reaction time was sufficient to reduce the impact, but not to eliminate it. It caught him across the left shoulder with enough force to put him down. He was up on one knee immediately. His blade was still active, but his left arm was hanging at an angle that meant he would not be fighting at full capability for the remainder of this engagement. Obi-Wan. Anakin's voice was flat, controlled. "I'm functional," Obi-Wan said, through teeth that were doing significant work. "Don't stop." The chamber floor had become treacherous. Debris from the platform cascade, craters in the stone where the detonations had struck, the scattered equipment of a legislative space that had been designed for speeches and was now receiving something considerably more demanding. The combat spread across this new terrain with the adaptability of people who had spent 3 years fighting in difficult places. Palpatine pressed the advantage of Obi-Wan's injury immediately. Of course he did. The attack on Obi-Wan's position came fast, and from a low angle, a Makashi thrust sequence designed to be answered by 2 functional arms and presenting a lethal problem for one. Mace intercepted. The interception cost him position, drove him left, and for approximately 4 seconds, Anakin and Palpatine were alone in their corner of the chamber, with no one between them. And in those 4 seconds, something changed. It was not dramatic. It announced itself with no particular ceremony and bore no resemblance to the thunderclap of destiny that the stories about the Chosen One had always implied. It was simply a shift, a quality change in the way the Force moved through him, subtle as a change in air pressure, as a river finding a lower channel. He had been fighting from Gemso, from technique, from the 20 years of training that had taken a 9-year-old boy's raw, enormous potential and given it structure and direction and purpose. All of that was still present. But underneath it, or perhaps through it, something else was present now, the Force coming through him not as his instrument but as its own, using the path of least resistance that 20 years of discipline had carved through him. Using him, rather than being used. He did not reach for it. He did not choose it. He simply stopped, for one breath, redirecting or managing or shaping what was moving through him, and let it move. The 4 seconds of isolation with Palpatine lasted long enough for Palpatine to feel it happen. The Sith Lord's eyes changed. The calculating warmth in them went out, and what replaced it was something that Anakin had never seen there before, had never expected to see there, not fear. The Sith rejected fear as a personal experience even while weaponizing it in others, but its close, cold neighbor. Uncertainty. The specific uncertainty of a being who has modeled all the variables and has just encountered one that was not in the model. He attacked anyway. He had no other mode. Anakin met it, and the Force moved through him like weather. The Senate building's communication hub occupied the sub-basement level of the eastern wing, 3 floors below the public concourse, accessible by 2 service lifts, and a maintenance stairwell that appeared on no visitor map and was marked on the staff schematics simply as relay infrastructure. Authorized personnel only. The door at the bottom of the stairwell was heavy, functional, undecorated. The door of a room that was never meant to be seen, only used. Rex came through it first. Behind him, Fenn, Thorn, Boyle, Woolley, Waxer, and Height, 6 men he had chosen for the same reason he chose everything, which was that he had watched each of them make a difficult decision under pressure and had seen the specific quality of the decision-making he needed today. Not the fastest, not the strongest. The ones who, at the moment when the situation exceeded the briefing, had looked at the actual problem in front of them instead of the problem they had prepared for. The hub was lit in the flat blue-white of operational lighting, the kind designed to be correct rather than comfortable, to make everything in the room exactly as visible as it needed to be, and no more. Banks of transmitter hardware lined 3 walls from floor to ceiling. Black and gray housings with indicator lights running in long status rows, each unit connected to the next by conduit bundles as thick as a man's forearm. The fourth wall was occupied by the primary control terminal, a curved desk of monitoring equipment, screens displaying transmission logs, signal strength readouts, the layered architecture of a system managing 10,000 frequencies simultaneously. 3 Republic technicians looked up from their stations. Rex's expression, and the expression of the 6 armored men behind him, communicated, without any spoken word, that this was not a routine security patrol and that the technicians' most productive immediate action was to move away from their terminals and sit against the far wall. The technicians were intelligent people who worked with information for a living. They assessed the situation and complied immediately. "Height," Rex said. Height was already moving toward the primary terminal, his helmet off, his eyes running across the readout architecture with the focused speed of a man who had been shown exactly what to look for and had been thinking about nothing else for the past 2 hours. Rex stood in the center of the room and did what he always did in the first moment of an operation. He took the space in completely. Not looking for threats, the room was secured. The technicians were seated. The door behind him was held by Waxer. He took it in the way you take in something you need to understand fully before you act on it, the way you look at terrain before you move through it. His eyes traveled the wall of hardware, the indicator lights running their status rows, the conduit bundles, the ceiling, where the bundles consolidated into 3 main trunks before disappearing through the wall toward the Senate building's larger infrastructure. 3 trunks. He had been told 3 redundancies. He looked at the 3 trunks and confirmed the number and filed it. "Got it," Height said. He said it with the flatness of a man who has found something he was hoping not to find. Rex crossed to the terminal. Height pointed at a section of the transmission log that was running in a separate window from the primary display, partitioned, slightly different in its formatting. The kind of architectural quarantine you implement when you need something to exist alongside a system without being fully integrated into it. The log showed traffic. Not current traffic. There was no active signal on this channel. But the channel existed. It had its own encryption header, its own frequency allocation, its own routing path through the building's infrastructure toward the Senate relay towers. And at the head of the log, 3 years ago, an installation notation, supplemental relay, executive authorization, Kaminoan contractor ref. 7719 CC. Rex read it twice. "What does it reach?" he asked. "Everything," Height said. He meant it literally. Every active clone in the GAR, every chip. Simultaneously, he pulled up the activation architecture, the pathway from signal origin through the relay to the transmission, the encoding structure of the command itself, already loaded, already formatted. Sitting in the channel's queue like a letter that has been written and sealed and needs only someone to carry it to the door. "It's been sitting here ready for 3 years, sir." Rex put one hand on the housing of the transmitter. The metal was cool under his palm. He stood there with his hand on it and looked at it and knew exactly what it was, the machine that would have ended them. All 3 million of them, all at once, converted in a single transmitted moment from soldiers to assassins without the knowledge or consent of a single one. Fives had known. Fives had stood in a medical bay and said there's something in our heads, and had been called unstable, had been called compromised, had been called a threat, by the very institution he was trying to warn. Rex had sat with him for 4 hours, had heard every word, had watched him die carrying information that was true, that had always been true, that was sitting right here in a sub-basement in a separate window in a transmission log, waiting. He became aware that his jaw was set so hard it was beginning to ache. He released the pressure deliberately. "How long to destroy the primary relay?" he asked. Height was already assessing. "Primary, fast, single point of failure. I can collapse the transmission pathway from the terminal itself, take maybe 40 seconds. But the secondary compensates automatically if the primary drops. And the tertiary compensates if the secondary drops." He looked up. "All 3 go simultaneously. The signal has nowhere to route. Then all 3 go simultaneously." Rex looked around at the room. Fen, Thorn, the secondary trunk, north wall, where it goes into the ceiling. Boyle, Woolley, tertiary. Follow it back to the junction at the east conduit bundle. Height stays at the terminal and takes the primary on my mark. He looked at each of them in turn. We do this together, or we don't do it. Understood? 5 helmets dipped. I need 2 minutes, Height said, to position the collapse correctly at the terminal. If I do it wrong, the secondary auto compensates before Fen and Thorn are ready. You have 2 minutes, Rex said. He stepped back from the terminal. He looked at the room again. The hardware. The technicians sitting quiet against the far wall, the indicator lights running their patient status rows. He thought about the men in his unit right now, scattered across 600 active deployments across the outer rim and the mid-rim, doing the work they had been built to do. He thought about Echo. About Fives. About every brother who had sat across from him at a campaign fire, and talked about what came after. About what you did when the war ended and the galaxy stopped needing you to do this specific thing. About who you were if you were not a soldier. He thought about the chip in his own head, the thing he had been not thinking about since Fives died. The way you don't think about a crack in a wall when the wall is still standing. He could not feel it. He had never been able to feel it. It was simply there, inert, waiting for a signal that had been queued in a sub-basement terminal for 3 years. If Rex had not been standing in this room, that signal would have reached his chip sometime in the next hours, and he would have. He stopped the thought before it completed. 90 seconds, Height said. Across the building, through 3 floors of Senate infrastructure and the specific density of durasteel and stone, Rex's comlink carried a background signal from the frequency Anakin had designated for the operation. He wasn't receiving it directly. The building's shielding made that unreliable at this depth. But the relay unit Waxer was holding at the stairwell door had line of sight to the next level and was translating the signal's carrier wave into a simple status indicator. Green, the Jedi were engaged. The operation was running. He looked at it. Green, 60 seconds, Height said. Rex thought about something the general had said to him in the hangar at the 3rd hour, crouched beside an engine housing that neither of them had been paying any attention to. That's why I'm asking you. Not that's an order. Captain or the Council requires or any of the formal language that their relationship had always had a parallel track of. Simply, I'm asking. Because Rex was the person who could be asked. Because of what Rex had built, through 7 years of campaigns and losses, and the specific difficult work of remaining a person while being used as a weapon, what Rex had built was the capacity to be asked, and to answer. The general trusted him with the part of the plan that everything else depended on. He thought that was worth something. 30 seconds, Height said. Fen, Rex said quietly. Thorn. They moved to their positions on the north wall, Fen with a charge placed against the secondary conduit trunk at the ceiling junction. Thorn with the detonator, waiting. On the east wall, Boyle and Woolley mirrored them at the tertiary trunk, the charge placed, the detonator in Boyle's hand. Rex looked at Height. Height's hands were at the terminal. He was watching a countdown of his own construction, a small display he had pulled up in the corner of the screen, timing the collapse sequence so that all 3 redundancies failed within the same half-second window. His face had the focused, emptied quality of a man in the last moments before doing something that cannot be undone. On your mark, sir, he said. Rex looked at the transmitter housing, at the activation sequence sitting queued and ready in the partitioned window. At 3 years of readiness that had never been triggered because the man who built it had been waiting for the right moment, and the right moment had been contingent on a weapon turning in his hand, and the weapon had not turned. He thought, Fives. This is for Fives, he said, Mark. The 3 things happened in a window of time that Height had calculated as 0.4 seconds, and that Rex experienced as simultaneous. The primary relay collapsed at the terminal. Height's pathway closure propagated through the channel architecture and folded the encryption routing back on itself, a technical failure that looked, to any external monitoring system, like a simple equipment fault. The secondary trunk at the north wall took the charge's detonation, and the conduit bundle separated from the ceiling junction with a sound like something tearing, and the backup relay that would have compensated for the primary failure found itself without a pathway to compensate through. The tertiary trunk on the east wall went a fraction of a second after Boyle's detonation, clean, the conduit bundle falling in a controlled collapse to the floor, the final redundancy severed. The indicator lights on the transmitter housing went from green to amber to red in sequence. Then, they went dark. The room was quiet. The three technicians against the far wall were looking at the equipment with the expressions of people who have just watched something expensive and important stop working and are calculating how to explain this in a report. Height had already stepped back from the terminal. Fen and Thorn were standing in the residual smoke of the detonation charge, looking at the ceiling junction where the secondary trunk had been. Rex's comlink spike, not a voice signal, not a transmission, just a carrier wave spike on the designated frequency, reached Waxer's relay unit at the stairwell door and translated to priority signal sent. Outgoing, headed for the clone frequency. Rex checked the relay status display on the terminal. The routing pathway was gone. The secondary was gone. The tertiary was gone. The signal had nowhere to go. He stood in the wreckage of the hub for a long moment. The smell of burned conduit and detonation residue was thick in the air. A familiar smell. A campaign smell. The smell of things being changed by force. He looked at his brothers. 6 men who had come down a service stairwell at dawn and done a thing that 3 million people would never know about. Because 3 million people were never going to know how close it had been. "It's done," Rex said. "Order 66 is offline." He looked at the dark indicator lights on the transmitter housing. Permanently, Height let out a breath. It was not a dramatic sound, just a breath, the kind that a person releases when they have been holding it without realizing it. Fen clapped a hand briefly on Thorn's shoulder. Boyle and Woolley exchanged a look that carried something in it that Rex recognized as the specific relief of men who have spent a long time next to a thing that could kill them and have just watched it made safe. Rex looked at his own hand. The hand that had been reaching, in the hangar, toward his temple. He looked at it for a moment. Then he put it to work, reaching for his comlink to signal the 501st's exterior positions. The hub was down. The relay was gone. The operation's first phase was complete. Above him, through 3 floors of stone and infrastructure. In the Senate chamber's cold blue standby light, the duel was still running. And somewhere in its geometry, the most powerful force-sensitive alive was fighting without reaching for the shortcut, without taking what was right there at the edge of his awareness, without becoming what the man across from him needed him to become. Rex didn't know any of that. He couldn't see it from here. But he had done his part. And he had done it because he was asked. That was enough. The Senate chamber had become a geography of what the fight had cost. 3 of the nearest repulsor lift platforms had come down, their containment fields blown out by the sustained force discharges of the past 20 minutes. Their housings cracked open on the chamber floor in attitudes of terminal arrival. The stone of the floor itself was marked in long, scorched channels where the lightning had grounded itself through whatever was available. The standby lighting had taken damage in the 3rd minute. 2 of the primary strips gone dark, the remaining ones casting the space in an uneven, cold blue that deepened some areas into full shadow and left others in a stark, flat illumination that was unkind to everything it touched. Mace Windu was on one knee at the chamber's eastern edge. He was alive. Functional was a more complicated assessment. His blade arm was responding. He still held the purple lightsaber, still active, its hum reduced, but continuous, but the sustained Va-pad engagement had extracted its cost. The form worked by channeling an opponent's dark side energy back through the practitioner, and the opponent had been Darth Sidious, and the volume of what had passed through Mace in the past 20 minutes was written in the lines of his face and the set of his shoulders and the way he was breathing. Which was the controlled, deliberate breathing of a man managing pain rather than the breathing of a man who doesn't have any. He was not getting up. Not yet. He knew his own body well enough to know that getting up now would mean going down again shortly, and going down again in the middle of this was not something he was prepared to contribute to the situation. He stayed where he was, and kept his blade active, and watched. Obi-Wan was on a platform section that had come to rest at a 15-degree tilt against the chamber wall, seated against it, his left arm immobile at his side, his right hand maintaining the grip on his lightsaber with the focused, deliberate attention of a man for whom releasing the blade is not an available option. He had pushed himself upright 10 minutes ago and stayed upright through will and the specific Jedi relationship with pain that is not its absence but its renegotiation. He was watching too. And Yoda stood in the center of the chamber floor, between Anakin and Palpatine, and he was the only one of the four of them who was not wounded, and he was breathing hard. Palpatine had spent himself. Not completely. Anakin could feel that he still had reserves, that the ancient darkness in him ran deep enough that depleted was a relative term and what looked like exhaustion in another being might be a different calculation in this one. But he had spent more than he intended to spend. The certainty that had been in his movements in the first minutes, that absolute, unapologetic fluency in violence, the fighting style of a being who has never needed to account for an opponent being better, that certainty was no longer the dominant quality. What had replaced it was concentration. He was working now. Actively, visibly working, which was not something he had needed to do for a very long time. And the unfamiliarity of it showed in the way it doesn't show in trained fighters, not in the technique, which remained formidable, but in the space between exchanges. The fractional pauses where the decision was being made rather than flowing from some prepared reserve. The Sith Lord was in territory he had not mapped. He was also, Anakin realized, running out of the thing that mattered most to his strategy. Time, whatever contingency architecture he had built his confidence on, the clone signal, the emergency powers, the network of loyalists embedded throughout the government, all of it had required the Jedi to be manageable, to be beatable within a window. And the window was closing, and they were still here, and the signal he had attempted to send 12 minutes ago had received no acknowledgement from the relay, which meant the relay was gone, which Palpatine had realized, but had not reacted to visibly, because visibly reacting to it was not something he was prepared to give them. But Anakin felt it. The change in the force around the Sith Lord when the signal went unanswered, a tightening, almost imperceptible, the adjustment of a being recalculating within a collapsing set of options. Yoda felt it too. His ears moved. He said nothing. Palpatine released the lightning. Not the targeted bursts he had been using in the later exchanges. The precise, surgical applications that were expensive to produce but controlled in their impact. This was different. This was both hands, fully open, the dark side moving through him at the volume it could be moved through a being of his power, when the being was no longer conserving, no longer managing for the long engagement. The lightning came out in a sustained, roiling wave that filled the space between them with white-blue light and the specific violent smell of air being torn apart at the molecular level. It went for Anakin, not for Mace, who was already down, not for Obi-Wan, who was compromised, not for Yoda, whose capacity to manage force lightning had been demonstrated twice already and filed as an unproductive target. For Anakin, the variable, the miscalculation, the weapon that had turned in his hand and become the center of everything that had gone wrong today. If Anakin went down, the chamber belonged to Palpatine again. The calculation was straightforward. Yoda's hands came up. He caught the lightning, not all of it. The volume was too large for a complete interception, but enough of it. His hands conducting the energy downward and into the stone of the chamber floor, his body absorbing the transmission with the practiced calm of someone who has performed this specific act before and understands its cost and has decided the cost is acceptable. The stone beneath his feet cracked in a starburst pattern, the heat of the discharge conducted through him into the ground. And Yoda's face did not change, except around the eyes, where something very old and very determined was visible for the fraction of a second before it was managed back to neutral. He could not do that again. His hands were trembling with a fineness that was only visible if you were looking for it. Anakin had 6 seconds. He used them to close the distance. He was not running. That was the thing about it. He was not running. He was walking. The same pace he had walked through the Coruscant morning with the other 3. The pace of someone who has made their decision and has nothing left to prove about it. The remaining lightning that Yoda had not intercepted struck his blade and traveled along it, and he let it travel. The force moving through him with the quality it had developed in the last phase of the engagement. Not his. Exactly, or not only his. The chosen quality of it meaning not chosen for him, but choosing through him. And he walked through the white-blue light of it toward the dark. Palpatine poured more power into the discharge. The lightning intensified. The light in the chamber went briefly absolute, every shadow eliminated, every surface flattened to the same white-blue exposure. Anakin's blade caught it, and his body channeled it, and he did not stop walking. More, the Sith Lord's face was doing something that it had not done at any previous point in the engagement. The composition was intact. The mask of ancient authority was still technically in place, but underneath it something was working that was not authority and was not composure, and was the thing that neither Sith philosophy nor 30 years of absolute power had been able to entirely eradicate from a being that had begun, once, as something mortal and afraid. Anakin kept walking. The lightning died. Not because Palpatine chose to stop. The choice was not available. The reserves were spent. The body that housed all this ancient darkness had physical parameters that could not be argued with. His arms dropped. The crimson blades were still active in his hands, but their angle had changed, no longer the confident forward angle of an engaged combatant, but the lowered, outward angle of a being whose arms are heavier than they were. He looked old. Not grandfatherly old. The other kind. The old of something that has been running from its own nature for a very long time, and has finally run out of road. He swung anyway. Both blades, a final assault, and it was formidable, because the technique was still there even when everything else was depleted. The muscle memory of 10,000 hours of practice not requiring reserves to execute, and it was dangerous in the specific way that a very skilled being fighting with everything remaining is always dangerous. The twin crimson blades drove at Anakin in a sequence that demanded full commitment to answer, that left no margin for anything less than complete technical presence. Anakin gave it complete technical presence. He gave it Form 5 and Form 5's 20 years of accumulated refinement, and the force moving through him and his own understanding of this specific opponent's style, built across the entire engagement, each exchange a data point now informing the response. He gave it everything he was, not the chosen one as a mythological category. Not the fulfillment of a prophecy as an external event, but Anakin Skywalker, specifically the boy from Tatooine, who had learned to fly because flying was freedom, and learned to fight because the galaxy needed him to, and learned to love because love was the only thing he had ever found that was bigger than fear. He answered the combination, and on the last beat of it, his blade caught both of Palpatine's hilts simultaneously. The angle was not possible by the standard mechanical analysis of lightsaber combat geometry. It required that both the opponent's blades be in a specific relative position to each other and to the intercepting blade for a window measured in fractions of a second. And it required the intercepting blade to be moving at the precise angle to catch both rather than one. And it required the force to be doing the calculation because the human nervous system could not do it fast enough. The force did the calculation. Both red hilts spun away. They hit the chamber floor at different distances and different angles, and their blades went dark in sequence. 2 brief extinctions of crimson light, and the chamber was suddenly less red and more blue and very quiet. Palpatine stood without weapons in a room he had spent 30 years acquiring, surrounded by the wreckage of what he had built and the 4 Jedi he had spent 30 years trying to destroy. He was breathing hard. So was Anakin. Do it then. His voice had lost nothing. Whatever the body's depletion had taken from him, it had not reached the voice, which was still the deep register of Darth Sidious rather than the practiced warmth of Sheev Palpatine, still carrying in it the ancient, cold authority of a being who had made himself into an institution through sheer force of will. He looked at Anakin with the yellow eyes that would never be the pale blue ones again, and he said, "Do it. Your code won't let you. Your mercy. The Jedi will never." "I don't do it for the code," Anakin said. He said it quietly. The quietness was not performance. It was the natural register of a man saying a true thing in a room where the truth was the only thing left. "I do it for every Jedi who died and didn't have to. For every soldier who was built to be murdered and nearly was this morning. For every planet you looked at and decided was a resource." He held Palpatine's gaze. "And for my children, who deserve to be born into a galaxy that doesn't have you in it." Something crossed Palpatine's face. Complex, layered, and too fast to fully read. The last movement of a very sophisticated instrument in the moment before it stops. There might have been, beneath everything, something that was almost relief. The relief of a being who has been performing for so long that the performance has become the only thing, and who can feel the weight of it lifting in the only way it ever could. He did not ask for mercy. Anakin did not hesitate. The strike was clean. Complete, the work of a Jedi Master at the full height of his capability, which meant it was also fast and without cruelty and utterly final. The last Sith Lord of the Rule of Two fell in the Senate chamber he had spent 30 years patiently taking over. With the stars visible through the gap in the dome above him and 4 lightsabers, Obi-Wan had gotten his active again, had pushed himself upright on his tilted platform, and held it burning in his right hand, filling the space with color. Blue, blue, purple, green. The crimson was gone. Nothing moved. The chamber held its breath with them, all the accumulated stone and history of it, the 1,000 sessions, the 1,000,000 speeches, the galaxy's 10,000 years of attempting to govern itself through argument rather than force, held still around this single moment of aftermath. Yoda exhaled. It was the sound of 9 centuries releasing something they had been carrying since before any of the others were born. He lowered his hands, which had stopped trembling. He looked at what was on the chamber floor, and then he looked away, at the gap in the dome above them, at the Coruscant sky that was coming through it. Full morning now, the city blazing in the light of a sun that had risen on the last day of one thing and was currently illuminating the first moments of whatever came next. Mace Windu sat down, not settled into a position, not managed a careful descent. Sat down, on the chamber floor, in the way that a man sits down when his legs have made a decision his authority cannot override. His purple blade went inactive. He put one hand flat on the stone beside him and looked at it for a moment, and then looked up. Obi-Wan's voice came from the tilted platform against the wall, still carrying in it the strain of the left arm and the controlled management of what that arm was currently doing to his baseline, but carrying also something else, the particular quality of a man who needs the answer confirmed before he allows himself to feel what the answer means. Is it over? Anakin looked at the chamber, at Mace on the floor, at Yoda with his hands at his sides and his eyes on the sky, at Obi-Wan on his tilted platform with his blade in his right hand and his left arm hanging wrong. It's over, he said. The Force moved. Not dramatically, not with the cinematic grandeur of a thing announcing itself. It moved the way weather moves when a pressure system resolves. A slow, pervasive shift. The kind that happens across a volume too large to have a single point of origin. Every Force-sensitive in the temple felt it. Every Jedi in the field, on 600 deployments across the outer and mid-rim, felt it. Some would describe it later as a sound that wasn't a sound, a sense of something tightly wound-releasing. The specific quality of a knot that has been pulled so long it has been mistaken for structure, discovering that it can simply open. The dark side's weight, the oppressive, accumulated presence of 30 years of Sith dominance over the Force's expression in the galaxy, lifted, like a hand removed from a bruise, like something that had been pressing, deciding to stop. In the Senate chamber, the 4 Jedi breathed the air of a galaxy that had just changed and did not say anything for a long time, because there was nothing to say that was adequate to it, and the silence was not empty, but full. Full of what had been paid, and what had been saved, and the enormous, quiet fact of what came next. The ordinary sounds of Coruscant came through the gap in the dome. Traffic, wind, somewhere, far below and far away, the sound of the city doing what the city always did, which was to continue, which was itself a kind of answer. The medical bay in the Senate building's east wing had been designed for dignitaries. It was not equipped for the aftermath of what the Senate chamber had become in the past hour, which meant the staff improvised with the competent urgency of people whose training has just encountered something beyond its intended scope. 2 of the 4 Jedi Masters who arrived in the corridor outside the Chancellor's suite that morning were now horizontal, and the other 2 were vertical only on a technicality, and the team of Republic medics working on them had stopped asking how any of this had happened, because the answers were not information that helped them do their immediate job. Obi-Wan's left shoulder was fractured in 2 places. The medic who told him this received the information back with the specific, focused attention of a man cataloging an operational constraint rather than a man receiving bad news about his own body. He asked when the arm would be functional. The medic told him 6 weeks for full recovery and read his expression correctly and added, for basic use, 3 days. Obi-Wan nodded and lay back against the bed and closed his eyes, not to sleep but to think, which was what Obi-Wan's closed eyes had always meant. Mace sat in the chair beside him in his shirt sleeves. Someone had taken his outer robe, at his own request. It had been in his way. And without it he looked neither smaller nor diminished, but different. Uninsulated, somehow, the formal architecture of the Master of the Jedi Order was in a pile on a chair in a medical bay, and what was sitting across from Obi-Wan was simply a man who was very tired and had burns on both forearms that he was not currently thinking about. They sat without speaking for a while. The medical bay had the specific quiet of a place doing serious work nearby, low voices, the sound of equipment, the soft collision of professional urgency managed into something orderly. "We almost didn't make it," Obi-Wan said. His eyes were still closed. "We did, though," Mace said. "Yes." A pause. "We did." Another pause. Shorter. "Because of Anakin." Mace looked at his bandaged forearms. He looked at the wall across from him. He looked at the middle distance where important reckonings tend to live. "Because of Anakin," he agreed. The HoloNet had been running fragmentary feeds for 90 minutes by the time Bail Organa reached the Senate building. He had been called by 3 people simultaneously, a senator colleague, his own chief of staff, and Padam in that order. And Padam's call had been the shortest and the most informative. He arrived to find the Senate building's exterior secured by clone troopers in the distinctive blue-marked armor of the 501st, the eastern entrance rerouted through a temporary security checkpoint, and the air of the Senate district carrying the particular charged quality of a place where something enormous has recently happened, and has not yet been fully understood by the people who witnessed it. He found Yoda in the corridor outside the medical bay. The ancient master was sitting on a stone bench that had probably not been sat on by a Jedi in its operational lifetime, his Geimer stick across his knees, looking at nothing specific with the quality of attention that meant he was looking at everything. Bail sat beside him, without being asked. They had worked together long enough that the protocol could be dispensed with. "How bad?" Bail asked. "Bad enough," Yoda said, "and better than it was." He turned his head slightly. "Alive. They are. All 4. He paused. "The galaxy is also alive. Better outcome, I had not dared fully to expect." Bail looked at the corridor, at the Senate building's stone ceiling, at the incongruous sight of the Jedi Order's eldest and wisest member sitting on a bench in his shirt sleeves with his eyes half closed. "What happens now?" he asked. Yoda considered this with the seriousness it deserved. "Now," he said, "the truth. All of it. And then, the long work." He looked at Bail directly. "Ready for that, are you, Senator?" "I've been ready for it for about 5 years," Bail said. Yoda made a sound that might, from a being with a less complicated relationship to dignity, have been something close to a laugh. "Then begin," he said. "Begin today." The truth went out within 24 hours. The evidence was comprehensive enough that comprehensiveness became its own argument. The documented Sith manipulation of Republic governance. The resonant contamination evidence from the Vision Codex, the Kaminoan contractor records for the inhibitor chip system, the recovered contents of Palpatine's private chambers where 30 years of a parallel life had been maintained in meticulous organized detail. The communication relay logs from the sub-basement hub showing the activation attempt and its failure. The financial records, the ones that once you knew where to look and what you were looking at, showed 2 sides of a war being funded from the same source through a chain of proxies that was sophisticated and nearly invisible, and, once visible, damning beyond any reasonable interpretation. Bail Organa presented it to the emergency Senate session. He did it without theater, without the rhetorical architecture of a man trying to persuade. He simply put it in front of them and let it be what it was. The Senate's reaction moved through disbelief into something more complicated and less nameable, a collective reckoning of an institution realizing how thoroughly it had been used. That reckoning would take years to complete. It began that afternoon. The clone army was placed in transitional status before the session ended. The inhibitor chip removal program was authorized and funded. The Kaminoan facilities came under immediate independent investigation. Captain Rex received no public acknowledgement of what he had done in the sub-basement hub. He had not expected any. He was debriefed by Anakin directly and asked if there was anything he needed. He said he needed to talk to his men. Anakin said that was available. Rex went to talk to his men. 3 weeks after the Senate chamber, Padme went into labor at the Republic's best medical facility on Coruscant, attended by the finest obstetric team that Bail Organa's considerable organizational capacity had been able to assemble on approximately 2 hours' notice. Obi-Wan arrived at the hospital with his left arm in a sling. Having been told by his medic that light activity was acceptable as long as light activity did not involve lightsaber combat, and having interpreted this instruction with the selective flexibility that characterized his entire relationship with medical advice, he found the waiting room and sat in it with a book he did not read, turning pages at intervals that bore no relationship to his reading speed. For 4 hours. Ahsoka arrived 90 minutes in. She had been on Coruscant since the morning after. The news had reached her at a resupply depot in the mid-rim, and she had commandeered the fastest available transport with a confidence that suggested the pilot had not been given much of a choice. She came into the waiting room still in her travel gear, looked at Obi-Wan, looked at the book he was not reading, and sat beside him without speaking. She could not sit still. Her feet moved, her hands moved. She stood up and walked to the window and came back and sat down again. And Obi-Wan found this unreasonably, deeply comforting. Bail arrived with food from the market below. He had asked someone what Padme was craving. He had then bought that and 4 other things, because he was not certain of the accuracy of his intelligence, and was not prepared to be responsible for an incorrect food delivery at this particular juncture. They waited. The door opened. Anakin stood in it. He was not wearing his robe. Had set it somewhere in the previous 4 hours in a location he would later be unable to identify, and his face had the specific quality of a man who has just experienced something that has permanently rearranged the internal furniture without his having had any input on the rearrangement. 2, he said. A boy and a girl. Ahsoka made a sound that was not entirely consistent with her general presentation as a composed individual. Bail put down the food. Obi-Wan closed the book he had not been reading and set it on the chair beside him and stood. "Both well?" he asked. "Both." Anakin stopped. He looked at the ceiling for a moment. "Yes," he said. "Both well. Luke first, then Leia." They were, both of them, immediately and completely themselves, which was apparent in the first 20 minutes, during which Luke displayed a serene, interested attention to everything within his field of vision that suggested he found the world reasonable and was prepared to engage with it on those terms, and Leia communicated with absolute clarity that she had arrived with opinions and intended to express them, and that the timeline for this expression was her own. Padme held them both and looked at them with the exhausted, luminous attention of someone who has just done the hardest thing they have ever done and discovered it was also the most important. "Hello," she said. "We've been waiting for you." Anakin came in and sat on the edge of the bed. He looked at his son's face, the small, complete, entirely new face of a person who had not existed this morning, and was now, undeniably, fully present and already distinctive. Luke's hand was closed around Anakin's mechanical finger with the uncomplicated grip of someone who has found something and sees no reason to let go. He laughed. It came out of him without permission or preparation, not the managed, shaped laugh of a man aware of how he sounds, but the real thing, the laugh that exists below the level where performance lives. Unguarded, unarchitectured, the laugh of a person who is simply, completely, without reservation happy, which was a state Anakin Skywalker had visited briefly and obliquely over the course of his life, but had never before inhabited so fully that it took up all the available space. Obi-Wan appeared in the doorway. He saw Padme holding Leia, who had temporarily suspended her opinions in favor of sleep. Anakin on the edge of the bed, his mechanical finger in Luke's grip, laughing, the room full of the ordinary extraordinary light of a Coruscant afternoon coming through the window. He stood in the doorway, and he did not say anything wise. He did not reach for the measured, careful language that was his natural register. He simply looked at the room and at the people in it and smiled. Privately, completely, the smile of a man who has wanted this for a long time and has lived to see it. The weeks became months. The Jedi Council's philosophical debate had been inevitable from the moment Yoda said "failed you, we have in the garden," and it ran with the thoroughness that 9 centuries of accumulated institutional caution applied to its own dismantlement. The anti-attachment doctrine was not abandoned, but examined. Genuinely. Painfully. With the honesty of people looking at evidence they would have preferred not to find. The Forbidden Philosophy Archive came out of the vault and into an open research classification. The formal ruling, when it came, used language that the Order had never used before. The Force works through love. Love does not exist outside the Jedi. It is expressed through them. Anakin requested reassignment from active duty. The Council granted it without deliberation. Jedi Master Anakin Skywalker took a teaching position in the temple, working with advanced students in lightsaber theory and Force philosophy. His class notes listed the final subject of the term as navigating the difficult things. The waiting list for his classes was 18 months long within the first week. The balcony of their apartment caught the evening light from the west. Coruscant at this hour was a particular kind of beautiful, the 1,000 towers catching the last of the sun at their peaks, while their bases warmed with the lights coming on for evening. The traffic streams thinning to the quieter flows of the day's end, the city doing its patient, continuous work of being a place where people lived. It was the same city it had always been. It was different now. Or beginning to be. Which was the best that could be asked of anything. Obi-Wan came, as he had taken to doing, with food from the market below. He had developed a working knowledge of Padam's current preferences that she found both touching and slightly alarming in its accuracy. He sat on the balcony with his tea. The arm was mostly functional now, the sling gone, the full movement returning in increments, and watched the traffic currents move. Anakin joined him after a while. Leia was asleep against his shoulder, finally, having made her position on the timing of sleep clear for the better part of an hour before conceding the point. He sat in the chair beside Obi-Wan, and the city spread out below them both. They sat in the comfortable silence of 2 people who have run out of things they need to say, and have arrived. Through that, at everything. Then Obi-Wan said, "You know, I always thought the prophecy would feel bigger. More ceremonial." Anakin looked at the city, at the lights coming on in their thousands, at the ordinary, irreplaceable, continuous fact of a world where people were making dinner and putting children to bed and arguing about small things and laughing at nothing in particular. All of it happening simultaneously in the 10,000 towers around them, all of it mattering. "What does it feel like?" he asked. Obi-Wan looked at him, at the sleeping child against his shoulder, at the lights of Coruscant running out to every horizon in every direction, the galaxy's most complicated city doing its most ordinary thing. "Like this," he said. "Exactly like this." The street musician 30 stories below changed to something slower. The city breathed. Leia breathed against Anakin's shoulder, small and certain and entirely herself. The evening held them all in it. The apartment, the balcony, the 2 men sitting with their tea, the city blazing around them, and asked nothing of any of them except to be present in it. Which they were. Which was enough. Which had always been enough. Let us know what you'd like to see next. The end.